Every ruin is a crime scene, every artifact, a witness that won't talk. For centuries we've dug, measured, dated, and theorized, and still, entire chapters of the human story remain sealed shut. Not because we haven't looked, because some things resist looking. Tonight isn't about certainty, it's about the gaps, the places where evidence runs out and imagination is forced to take over. 3 hours, no resolutions, just the long, patient sound of unanswered questions. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away. This is where the trail goes cold. High in the Baian-Kara-Ula mountains, along the remote border between China and Tibet, a cluster of caves cuts into the granite. Dark, cold, and largely forgotten by the outside world. It was here, according to the story that has circulated for decades, that a team of archaeologists made a discovery in 1938 unlike anything they had catalogued before. Hundreds of stone discs, each roughly a foot in diameter, with a hole bored precisely through the center and a tightly wound double spiral groove etched across the surface. At first glance, they might have been mistaken for unusual pieces of ancient pottery or ceremonial tools, but closer inspection revealed something stranger. Within the grooves, some researchers claimed, were tiny characters, symbols too small to read with the naked eye, arranged in a pattern that resembled writing, though unlike any script from the region's known history. The caves themselves held other oddities. Skeletal remains were reportedly found inside, described as unusually small in stature, with skulls that seemed disproportionately large for their frames. Faded paintings on the cave walls depicted the sun, the moon, and the earth connected by rows of dots, an image some have interpreted as a rudimentary star map, though no formal astronomical survey has confirmed this reading. This is where the story typically shifts from documented archaeology into something far harder to verify. According to the accounts that have been repeated since the mid-20th century, one of the discs eventually made its way to a Chinese academic, Professor Tsum Nui, who spent years attempting to translate the etched script. The claim goes that he eventually deciphered fragments describing a group of beings who had crash-landed in the mountains long ago and struggled to survive among the local population. A narrative that, if true, would place the Dropa discs among the most extraordinary artifacts ever unearthed. But here is where the trail grows thin. No peer-reviewed paper documenting this translation has ever surfaced. No verified photograph of Professor Tsum Nui exists in academic records. The Beijing Academy of Sciences, often cited as having studied the discs, has no confirmed record of the research taking place. Some researchers who have traced the story's origins point to a 1960s magazine article, speculative in nature, as the likely source of many of these details, later repeated and expanded until they hardened into something resembling established fact. And yet the region itself is real. The caves exist. Local oral traditions among Tibetan and Han communities do speak of small, unusual peoples said to have once lived in the mountains. Stories that predate the 20th century accounts and raise their own quiet questions about where legend ends and memory begins. No disc has ever been made available for independent laboratory testing. No institution has produced verified imaging of the alleged script. What remains is a story built from fragments, some cultural, some archaeological, some almost certainly embellished, with no clear line separating one from another. Was there ever a set of stone discs at all? If so, what were they? Tools, ceremonial objects, something else entirely? And why, despite decades of interest, has no verifiable specimen ever reached a modern laboratory for analysis? Perhaps the truth was lost somewhere between the mountains and the retelling. Or perhaps it is still there, sealed in rock, waiting for someone to look again. From the granite silence of the Baian-Kara-Ula mountains, our search for what history left unfinished carries us across the world, down into the lowlands of southern Ecuador, to a modest parish garage in the city of Cuenca, an unlikely setting for one of the strangest archaeological puzzles of the 20th century. It was here, from the 1960s through the 1990s, that Father Carlo Crespi, an Italian-born Salesian priest, quietly amassed one of the most debated private collections in the history of archaeology. Crespi had come to Ecuador as a missionary and over decades earned deep trust among the indigenous communities of the region, the Shuar and other Amazonian peoples who lived along the rivers and jungle paths surrounding Cuenca. Grateful for his medical aid, education efforts, and generosity, locals reportedly began bringing him gifts. Some were unremarkable: pottery shards, carved stones, everyday tools consistent with the region's known cultures. Others were not. Photographs and surviving accounts describe gold and metal artifacts, unlike anything catalogued from South American antiquity. Plaques etched with rows of unfamiliar symbols, animal figures with features that don't correspond to any known regional species, and geometric patterns bearing an unsettling resemblance to imagery from entirely different, distant civilizations. Crespi displayed many of these pieces informally, without rigorous provenance records, in a growing makeshift museum attached to his church, a decision that would later make the collection nearly impossible to authenticate. Word of the collection eventually reached researchers and writers interested in ancient mysteries. And by the 1970s, the story had grown into something larger than Crespi himself, a humble, and by most accounts unassuming man, likely ever intended. Some visitors described pieces depicting what appeared to be pyramids alongside elephants, animals with no confirmed presence in pre-Columbian South America. Others pointed to a large stone slab, sometimes referred to as the Crespi stone, etched with rows of glyphs that some fringe researchers claimed resembled ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, or even undeciphered scripts from far older, unidentified traditions. What are we to make of artifacts that seem to blend cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Mainstream archaeologists offer a more grounded, if less thrilling, explanation. Many pieces in the Crespi collection have since been identified as far more recent than they first appeared. Some crafted from melted-down colonial and even 20th century metal, likely produced by local artisans, occasionally incorporating imagery inspired by tourist curios, National Geographic clippings, or imported decorative objects. It's a plausible answer, and in many cases likely the correct one for a large portion of the collection. But even here, the story resists a clean resolution, because not every piece has been definitively traced. Crespi's own records were minimal, informal, and in many cases non-existent. Gifts given and received in trust, not itemized for future scholars. After his death in 1982, and following a suspicious fire that damaged parts of the collection, many original items were dispersed, sold, or lost entirely, scattered across private hands and small regional institutions with little documentation. What survives today is a fragmented archive. Some pieces studied and dismissed, others simply unaccounted for, their origins never formally tested. This gap between what is known and what is missing is precisely where speculation has taken root. Some researchers have proposed that a portion of the collection may represent genuine artifacts from an unidentified pre-Columbian culture, one whose metalworking or symbolic traditions have not yet been matched to any known society in the archaeological record. Others go further, suggesting the imagery hints at contact between ancient South America and distant civilizations across the ocean, a proposition that remains firmly outside mainstream consensus and largely unsupported by peer-reviewed evidence. Neither claim has been proven, neither has been fully disproven either, largely because so much of the original material was never subjected to independent testing before it disappeared from view. What we're left with, then, is not a solved case, but an incomplete one, a collection assembled by a man with no formal archaeological training, displayed without academic rigor, examined only in fragments after the fact. Was Crespi in possession of something extraordinary, evidence of a lost tradition never recorded by history? Or did affection and generosity slowly blur the line between authentic heritage pieces and well-intentioned gifts of little historical weight? Cuenca still remembers Father Crespi fondly, not as the center of a controversy, but as a man who gave much of his life to a community that trusted him deeply. Perhaps that trust is itself part of why the truth has become so difficult to isolate. The objects he received were not gathered under scientific conditions, cataloged with location data, or protected from the passage of time. They arrived as gifts, kept out of gratitude, displayed out of pride, and only much later scrutinized by people looking for answers no one had thought to preserve. Somewhere in storage rooms, private collections, or perhaps lost entirely to fire and time, remnants of the Crespi collection likely still exist, unexamined and unresolved. If a genuine artifact from an unknown culture was ever among them, would we even recognize it now, stripped of its context, mixed in with decades of imitation and myth? The jungle rivers that once carried these objects toward a small parish in the Andes continue to flow, indifferent to the questions they left behind. And so the collection remains what it has always been since Crespi's passing, not a solved mystery, but an unfinished inventory waiting for someone to look closely enough, and soon enough, to tell the difference between memory and legend. From the jungle rivers of Ecuador, we follow the thread of unresolved history eastward across oceans to the sun-scorched archives of Egyptology, and to a document that, if genuine, was never meant to describe anything of this earth. The story begins not in a tomb or a temple, but in the Vatican's Egyptian Museum, sometime in the 1930s. Father Alberto Tulli, an Italian priest and respected Egyptologist serving as director of the museum's Egyptian collection, was traveling through Egypt when he came across a papyrus fragment in the possession of an antiquities dealer in Cairo. According to Tully's own account, the price being asked was too high for him to purchase it outright, so he did what many scholars of his era did when faced with a fleeting opportunity. He copied the text by hand, intending to study it further once funding could be secured. The original papyrus, whatever it was, vanished from the historical record shortly afterward. No photograph of it has ever surfaced. No institution holds it today. All that remains is Tully's transcription, and the extraordinary claims about what it contained. The text, based on Tully's notes, was said to date to the reign of Thutmose III, an Egyptian pharaoh who ruled during the 15th century BC, a period well documented through inscriptions, monuments, and administrative records. But this particular fragment, if the transcription is accurate, described something distinctly outside the pharaoh's usual military campaigns and building projects. It spoke of a circle of fire appearing in the sky, silent, without wind or storm, drifting for days before rising higher and eventually vanishing among the stars. The account reportedly described panic among the population, priests summoned to interpret the event, and multiple such fire circles witnessed on separate occasions, some described as brighter than the sun itself. Why would a pharaonic scribe, working within a tradition built almost entirely around solar deities, divine order, and the recording of tangible political events, dedicate space to describing an object behaving so unlike anything else in the Egyptian sky? That question is precisely where the mainstream and the speculative interpretations begin to part ways. Egyptologists who take the account seriously as a historical curiosity tend to favor a grounded explanation. Ancient Egyptian texts are dense with symbolic and religious language, descriptions of celestial disks, divine fire, and sky-based omens appear throughout Egyptian mythology, often referring to solar phenomena, meteorological events, or metaphorical descriptions of political and religious significance rather than literal objects. A sundog, an unusual atmospheric event, a meteor procession, or simply poetic religious language describing the sun disk itself could plausibly explain a passage like this, particularly once translated, copied, and interpreted by scholars separated from the original context by thousands of years and multiple layers of transcription. But this explanation, however reasonable, runs into the same obstacle that defines nearly every discussion of the Tulli Papyrus. There is no original document left to examine. No modern Egyptologist has been able to verify Tully's hieroglyphic transcription against a physical source. No trace of the papyrus has been found in the Vatican's holdings, in Cairo's antiquities archives, or in any private collection that has come to light in the decades since. What exists is a second-hand copy, made by a credentialed but singular witness, describing a document that effectively disappeared the moment it was translated. This absence has left considerable room for more fringe interpretations to take hold. Some researchers interested in ancient astronaut theories have pointed to the papyrus as potential evidence of unexplained aerial phenomena witnessed and recorded by an ancient civilization, a claim that remains firmly outside academic consensus and unsupported by any corroborating archaeological evidence. Others have suggested more modest but still unconventional possibilities. An unusually vivid meteor event, an atmospheric phenomenon not fully understood even by modern standards, or a genuine historical account of something the Egyptians themselves struggled to categorize within their existing religious framework. Skeptics, meanwhile, raise a different set of questions entirely. Was the transcription accurate? Did Tulli, working quickly and without the original in hand, correctly interpret a script that even trained Egyptologists find notoriously difficult to render without ambiguity? Or did later retellings, passed through decades of retelling in books and articles about ancient mysteries, gradually reshape a modest symbolic passage into something far more sensational than the original scribe ever intended? Without the papyrus itself, none of these questions can be definitively answered. Father Tulli died in 1958, and no additional notes, sketches, or corroborating materials from his research have been located since. The Vatican Museum has never claimed to possess the original fragment, and Egyptological databases list the Tulli Papyrus not as a confirmed artifact, but as a documented account of a now missing text. A curious footnote rather than an established primary source. So we are left once again with a transcription of a translation of an object no one alive has seen firsthand. Was it a genuine record of an unusual sky event described in the language available to the people who witnessed it? Was it a symbolic or mistranslated passage inflated by decades of retelling into something it never claimed to be? Or is it simply a story about a story, copied once, lost once, and never verifiable again? Somewhere, perhaps in a private collection, a forgotten archive, or a box never properly catalogued, the original papyrus may yet exist, waiting to answer the questions its copy could never fully settle. The papyrus fragment is gone, but the questions it raised are not so easily set aside. And as if in answer, the ground itself offers another kind of record. Not written in ink, but carved into stone, on a windswept basalt plateau in the Golan Heights, in northern Israel, where the earth seems to have been arranged with quiet, deliberate purpose. Scattered across this landscape near the town of Shamir lie hundreds of dolmens, massive stone structures, each built from enormous slabs of basalt, some weighing several tons, arranged into chamber-like formations topped with a single capstone. Dolmens are not unique to this region. Similar megalithic structures appear across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East, generally understood by archaeologists as burial monuments constructed during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Ages, roughly the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. On the surface, the Shamir field fits neatly within this broader tradition. A necropolis, vast and ancient, built by early agricultural communities to honor and contain their dead. And yet the closer researchers have looked at this particular field, the more it seems to resist easy categorization. Unlike many dolmen sites elsewhere, several chambers at Shamir contain carvings, geometric engravings cut directly into the interior stone, including circular motifs, straight incised lines and patterns whose precise meaning has never been firmly established. Some of these carvings appear worn in ways that don't fully match the wear patterns found elsewhere on the same stones, raising quiet, unresolved questions about whether all of the markings were made at the same time, by the same hands, or for the same purpose. Were later visitors, centuries or even millennia after the dolmens were built, returning to rework or reinterpret symbols left by the original builders? Or do these carvings represent something added long after the tombs had ceased to serve their original function altogether? The scale of the field itself deepens the puzzle. Archaeological surveys have identified well over 400 dolmens spread across the plateau, an extraordinary concentration of monumental labor for a region whose Chalcolithic population, based on other settlement evidence, does not appear to have been especially large. Constructing even a single dolmen of this size required significant coordination, quarrying multi-ton basalt slabs, transporting them without draft animals or wheeled vehicles, and positioning capstones with enough precision that many structures have remained largely intact for thousands of years. Building hundreds of them raises a quieter but persistent question. What kind of social organization, belief system, or sustained ritual purpose could motivate a community to invest so heavily and so repeatedly in monuments to the dead? Mainstream archaeology offers a reasonable framework for approaching these questions. Researchers generally interpret dolmen fields as evidence of complex mortuary traditions among early pastoral or semi-nomadic communities. Populations that may not have left behind permanent villages, but clearly placed enormous cultural and spiritual weight on how and where their dead were honored. Basalt, abundant in the volcanic terrain of the Golan, would have been the most practical building material available, and the repetition of form across hundreds of structures may simply reflect a shared, standardized burial custom passed down across generations. But standardized customs don't always explain every anomaly found within them. Some researchers have pointed to the astronomical alignment of certain dolmens, capstone openings or chamber orientations that, in a handful of documented cases, appear to correspond with solstice sunrises or specific stars on the horizon. Formal archaeoastronomical study of the Shamir field remains limited, and not every claimed alignment has been independently verified, which leaves this particular thread suspended somewhere between coincidence and design. If intentional, it would suggest a level of astronomical awareness not always assumed of the communities credited with building these tombs. If coincidental, it's simply one more detail that happens to align a little too neatly with the sky. Excavations at the site have also uncovered surprisingly few skeletal remains relative to the sheer number of structures present, a discrepancy some attribute to the region's acidic basalt soil, which tends to accelerate the decomposition of organic material over thousands of years. Others have used this same gap in the evidence to suggest the dolmens may have served purposes beyond simple burial. Ceremonial markers, territorial boundaries, or ritual spaces used and reused across many centuries. Their original function gradually layered over by later generations who inherited the stones without necessarily inheriting the reasons behind them. None of these possibilities cancel the others out. A monument can be a tomb and a marker of the sky. A carving can be original and later reworked. A tradition can be both practical and profoundly spiritual, its full meaning understood only by the people who practiced it, and lost the moment their voices went silent. What remains today is a field of silent stones, arranged with clear intention but incomplete explanation. Who determined where each dolmen would stand? Why carve circles and lines into some chambers and leave others bare? And what does it mean that a community, working without the tools we associate with monumental construction, chose to shape a landscape so thoroughly around the memory of its dead? The basalt still holds its position on the plateau, unmoved by centuries of speculation. Whatever certainty the builders carried with them into these chambers, they left the stones to speak in their place. And the stones, so far, have chosen to say very little. The stones of Shamir keep their silence still, but not every ancient mystery is written in rock. Some are drawn from mud and water, preserved not by dry desert air, but by the very element that should have destroyed them. To find one, we travel to the shores of Lake Kastoria, in the mountainous region of northern Greece, where a submerged settlement once thrived, unnoticed, at the bottom of the water for thousands of years. In 1932, unusually low water levels exposed traces of a prehistoric lake settlement near the modern village of Dispilio. Though it wasn't until systematic excavations began in the early 1990s, led by archaeologist George Hormuziadis, that the site revealed the full extent of what it had been quietly preserving. Beneath layers of lake sediment, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neolithic settlement built on wooden platforms above the water, dating back roughly 7,500 years. A discovery significant enough on its own, offering rare insight into how early farming communities in Europe lived, built, and organized their daily lives. But among the settlement's many artifacts, one small object drew far more attention than the wooden post holes and pottery fragments surrounding it. A modest wooden tablet, roughly the size of a hand, its surface covered in a series of incised marks. At first glance, one might expect little more than abstract decoration or the kind of unstructured scratches so often found on utilitarian objects from this period. But the marks on the Dispilio tablet appeared different, more consistent, more deliberately arranged, prompting immediate and still unresolved questions. Were these symbols, in the sense we understand written language? Was this an early attempt at recording information, thousands of years before writing is generally believed to have emerged in the historical record? Or is the human eye, drawn instinctively toward pattern, simply projecting structure onto marks that never carried any linguistic meaning at all? The stakes of that question are considerable. The oldest confirmed writing systems, cuneiform script from ancient Mesopotamia and hieroglyphic writing from ancient Egypt, are generally dated to around 3,400 to 3,200 BC. The Dispilio settlement, by contrast, has been dated to approximately 5,500 BC, placing the tablet more than 2,000 years before either of those systems is believed to have developed. If the marks on this tablet do represent a genuine writing or proto-writing system, it would suggest that some early European communities had begun experimenting with recorded symbolic communication far earlier than mainstream chronology currently allows. That "if" carries enormous weight, and most of the scholarly caution surrounding the tablet centers on it. Mainstream archaeologists generally urge restraint before drawing conclusions. A single artifact, however intriguing, is difficult to interpret with confidence, particularly when the broader context, other examples of similar marks, comparative samples from neighboring sites, or a larger body of related objects, remains limited. Some researchers propose that the symbols may represent a system of counting, ownership marks, or symbolic notation tied to trade, resource management, or ritual practice, functional in purpose, but not necessarily a true written language capable of recording complex ideas or narratives. Similar marking systems, sometimes described as proto-writing, have been documented at other Neolithic sites across Europe and the Near East, suggesting that symbolic notation may have developed gradually and in multiple locations, long before anything resembling formal writing took shape. Others, working closer to the fringes of mainstream academic consensus, have suggested something more provocative: that the Dispilio tablet may represent an early independent step toward literacy, developed separately from the writing traditions later credited with originating in Mesopotamia, only to be lost when the settlement was eventually abandoned, and its knowledge, whatever it consisted of, faded along with it. This theory remains speculative and lacks the kind of corroborating evidence, additional tablets, related inscriptions, or continuous cultural transmission that would be needed to move it from possibility into established fact. Complicating matters further is the tablet's physical condition. Wood rarely survives for thousands of years, and only the unique oxygen-poor environment at the bottom of the lake allowed this fragile object to endure at all. But that same preservation process has made certain scientific dating and material analyses more difficult to interpret with full confidence, leaving some of the tablet's contextual details less precisely established than researchers might prefer when evaluating a claim of this magnitude. So the tablet remains where the evidence has left it: intriguing, unresolved, and resistant to easy classification. Are we looking at an early form of writing, developed independently and ahead of its time? A functional but non-linguistic system of symbols, meaningful to its makers but never intended to convey the kind of complex information we associate with true script? Or simply a pattern our modern minds are eager to read as language, shaped by our own deep, almost instinctive desire to find familiar meaning in the unfamiliar past? Somewhere beneath the waters of Lake Castoria, the remnants of that Neolithic settlement continue to rest, largely undisturbed, holding whatever additional context might one day clarify what its people were trying to say, if they were saying anything at all. If the marks at Dispilio raise questions about symbols lost to water, another set of tablets found hundreds of miles inland raises those same questions about symbols lost to fire and burial. To find them, we travel to the village of Tărtăria, in the Transylvanian region of Romania, where a modest archaeological dig in 1961 would eventually challenge some of the most fundamental assumptions about where and when human beings first began to write. The excavation, led by archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa, was investigating a Neolithic settlement associated with the Vinča culture, a widespread and sophisticated farming civilization that flourished across the Balkans roughly 7,000 years ago. Within a pit alongside burned animal bones, a fragmented human figurine, and other ritual-associated objects, Vlasa's team uncovered 3 small clay tablets, their surfaces covered in rows of incised symbols, some resembling combs, branches, and abstract geometric forms unlike typical Vinča pottery decoration. What made the discovery extraordinary wasn't simply the symbols themselves, but their apparent age. Based on stratigraphic context and later radiocarbon analysis of associated organic material, the tablets were dated to approximately 5,300 BC, a date that, if accurate, would place them more than 2,000 years before the earliest confirmed writing systems in Sumer and Egypt. For a brief period, some researchers proposed the tablets might represent the oldest known writing in human history, developed independently by a European Neolithic culture, centuries before literacy is believed to have emerged anywhere else in the world. That claim, unsurprisingly, did not go unchallenged. Much of the mainstream skepticism centers not on the tablets' age, but on their context and purpose. Critics point out that the symbols on the Tărtăria tablets closely resemble decorative motifs found throughout other Vinča culture artifacts, pottery, figurines, and ritual objects, where similar marks appear to function as symbolic or religious imagery, rather than a structured system capable of recording language. Some researchers argue that grouping decorative or ritual symbols together doesn't necessarily indicate writing in the linguistic sense, any more than repeated patterns on textiles or pottery from other ancient cultures would be classified as literacy, simply because the marks appear consistent and intentional. There are also lingering questions about the tablet's archaeological context itself. The pit in which they were found also contained burned human bone fragments, leading some scholars to interpret the site as part of a ritual or funerary deposit, rather than a location associated with practical record-keeping. If the tablets held ceremonial or symbolic significance tied to burial practices, their purpose may have had little to do with communication in the way we typically define written language, and everything to do with belief systems whose full meaning has since been lost. The dating itself, while generally accepted by most researchers today, has not entirely escaped scrutiny either. Some scholars have raised questions about whether the radiocarbon samples used to date the surrounding materials accurately reflect the age of the tablets themselves, given the complexities of stratigraphy at a site excavated more than 60 years ago, using methods considerably less precise than those available to archaeologists today. Most current specialists in Neolithic Europe accept the early date as reasonably well supported, but the tablet's extraordinary claims that they may represent one of the earliest instances of proto-writing anywhere in the world continue to invite a level of caution that more ordinary artifacts rarely receive. And so, much like the tablet recovered from the depths of Lake Castoria, the Tărtăria tablets occupy an uncertain space between 2 competing interpretations. Were these symbols an early independent attempt at symbolic communication, evidence that written language or something approaching it may have emerged in multiple places around the world far earlier than conventional history assumes? Or do they represent something else entirely, a system of religious or ceremonial marks, meaningful to the Vinča people in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct, but never intended to function as writing in the way we understand the term today? Adding to the difficulty, no comparable tablets bearing matching symbols have been discovered elsewhere within Vinča culture sites, despite decades of continued excavation across the region. If this were a widespread system of early writing, why does it appear so far in only this single isolated context? Is this simply a matter of incomplete archaeological luck, waiting for future excavations to uncover similar examples? Or is the very isolation of the Tărtăria tablets itself a clue, suggesting they may have served a highly specific, perhaps singular ritual purpose, never intended for wider or repeated use? The 3 tablets remain today in the collection of the National Museum of Transylvanian History in Cluj-Napoca, still studied, still debated, and still resistant to full consensus more than 60 years after they were first lifted from the soil. Whatever the Vinca people intended when they pressed those marks into wet clay, they left behind no key to translate their meaning, no second set of tablets to confirm a pattern, and no written record explaining why these particular symbols were buried alongside their dead. Perhaps future excavations across the Balkans will one day uncover a companion piece, a matching tablet, a related inscription that might finally clarify what the Tărtăria symbols were meant to convey. Until then, they remain exactly as they were found, fragments of a message we may never fully be able to read. The Tărtăria tablets remain locked in their silence, but the search for humanity's earliest attempts at symbolic communication doesn't end in Europe. It continues across the Atlantic, high on the Bolivian Altiplano, near the ancient city of Tiwanaku, where a weathered stone figure has spent decades at the center of one of archaeology's more unusual disputes. The object in question is a small andesite statue, roughly half a meter tall, known as the Pokotia Monolith, discovered in the early 1970s near the town of Pokotia, not far from the famed ruins of Tiwanaku, a monumental pre-Columbian city that once served as the ceremonial and political center of a powerful Andean civilization, flourishing between roughly 500 and 1000 AD. Carved in a style broadly consistent with other Tiwanaku-era statuary, the monolith depicts a human-like figure with a rectangular head and stylized features, its surface marked in several places with rows of small, deliberate incisions. For years, the statue remained a relatively minor piece within the broader catalog of Tiwanaku artifacts, its carved lines noted but not closely studied. That changed in the 1990s, when the monolith drew renewed attention after comparisons were proposed between its incised markings and certain ancient scripts from the opposite side of the world, most notably early Sumerian cuneiform, a writing system that developed in Mesopotamia thousands of years before Tiwanaku existed, and separated from the Andes by an ocean, a hemisphere, and, according to conventional history, any plausible means of direct cultural contact. The claim, when it surfaced, was striking in its implications. If the markings on the Pokotia monolith genuinely corresponded to Sumerian script or a related ancient writing system, it would suggest some form of contact, however indirect, between ancient Andean and ancient Near Eastern cultures long before any documented seafaring technology capable of bridging that distance is known to have existed. It's the kind of claim that, if substantiated, would reshape long-standing assumptions about the isolation of pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. Mainstream archaeologists and epigraphers, however, have approached this interpretation with considerable skepticism, and for reasons that extend beyond simple resistance to an unconventional idea. Cuneiform script, as it developed in Mesopotamia, followed a well-documented evolution from earlier pictographic systems into a highly structured wedge-shaped writing method, with thousands of confirmed inscriptions providing extensive comparative material for scholars to work from. The markings on the Pokotia monolith, by contrast, are limited in number, and critics argue that visual similarity between isolated marks and elements of a known script does not on its own constitute evidence of a genuine linguistic connection. Human symbol making, particularly simple geometric or linear incisions, often produces coincidental resemblances across entirely unrelated cultures, separated by vast distances and time, simply because there are only so many ways to carve a straight line, a cross, or an angular mark into stone. There are also unresolved questions surrounding the statue's own history and condition prior to its closer academic examination. Some researchers have raised concerns about the monolith's provenance, its exact excavation context, and whether the surface incisions may have been altered, added to, or reinterpreted at some point between its initial discovery and its later analysis. A possibility that, if true, would undermine any claims of ancient cross-cultural script without necessarily resolving what the original, unaltered marks might have represented. This is where the more speculative interpretations enter the conversation, occupying a space the available evidence has not yet been able to close. Some independent researchers maintain that the resemblance to Sumerian characters is too specific to dismiss entirely as coincidence, suggesting the possibility, without offering the kind of rigorous, peer-reviewed comparative analysis that would be needed to support such a significant claim, that ancient transoceanic contact may have occurred earlier and more extensively than currently accepted models allow. Others propose a more modest middle ground, that the markings may represent an entirely independent Andean symbolic tradition, one that simply happens to share superficial visual traits with unrelated scripts from other parts of the ancient world, a phenomenon not unheard of in the broader history of early symbolic notation. What remains largely absent from this debate is definitive resolution. No widely accepted translation of the Pokotia Monolith's markings exists within mainstream epigraphy. No corroborating artifacts bearing similar Andean Sumerian-style inscriptions have been identified at other Tiwanaku-related sites, leaving the monolith, much like several other artifacts explored in this collection, in a category of its own, difficult to fully dismiss, and equally difficult to firmly confirm. The statue itself remains part of Bolivia's archaeological heritage, its carved surface still bearing the same lines that sparked decades of debate, unmoved by the arguments made on its behalf or against it. Were those marks an attempt at communication, born from a tradition too distant and fragmentary for modern scholars to fully reconstruct? Did they emerge entirely independently, shaped by the same basic human instinct to organize meaning into simple carved lines, wherever and whenever that instinct arose? Or is the resemblance researchers have identified simply a trick of pattern recognition, the mind's tendency to find connection in coincidence? Perhaps only a wider body of comparative evidence, still waiting somewhere in the archaeological record of the Andes, will ever settle the question. Until then, the Pokotia monolith continues to sit quietly among the ruins of Tiwanaku, holding whatever meaning its makers intended, just out of reach of certainty. The Pokotia monolith keeps its markings to itself, but not every ancient inscription is carved onto a single, portable object. Some cover entire stretches of ground, so large that for decades the safest way to protect them was simply to bury them again. That's the story of a rock outcrop in West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, known as the Cochno Stone, one of the largest and most elaborately marked pieces of prehistoric rock art anywhere in Europe. Measuring roughly 42 feet long and 26 feet wide, the Cochno Stone is a broad, flattened expanse of natural rock covered in hundreds of carved cup and ring marks, spirals, grooves, and geometric patterns, believed to have been created sometime during the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, likely between 3000 and 2000 BC. Cup and ring carvings, small circular depressions often surrounded by concentric rings, are found at prehistoric sites across the British Isles and parts of continental Europe, but rarely at this scale, and rarely with this density of overlapping design covering a single, continuous surface. The stone was first formally documented in 1887, though local awareness of its markings likely predates that record considerably. For decades afterward, it remained a site of ongoing academic interest, examined periodically by researchers curious about the meaning behind its carvings. But by the mid-20th century, the stone had become increasingly vulnerable, subjected to vandalism, foot traffic, and the general wear that comes with public accessibility, to the point that in 1965, following a detailed survey and casting of its surface, local authorities made the decision to bury the Cochno Stone entirely beneath a protective layer of soil, sealing it away from the public for more than 50 years. That burial, intended as protective, only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the site. When the stone was finally re-excavated in 2015 and 2016 by a team led by archaeologist Kenny Brophy using modern photogrammetry and 3D scanning technology unavailable to earlier researchers, the resulting analysis revealed carvings even more extensive and intricate than the earlier 20th century surveys had fully captured, along with modern graffiti and testing marks left behind by decades of visitors and, in one case, at least one earlier archaeological excavation not fully documented in surviving records. What then do these hundreds of carved symbols actually represent? This is where the investigation, much like others in this collection, moves from established fact toward genuine, unresolved speculation. Mainstream archaeological interpretation generally situates cup and ring marks within a broader Neolithic and Bronze Age tradition of ritual or ceremonial rock art, though the precise meaning behind the symbols has never been definitively established. Some researchers propose the carvings may relate to territorial marking, indicating boundaries meaningful to prehistoric communities organizing land use or seasonal movement. Others suggest a connection to water and weather, noting that many cup and ring sites across Britain appear positioned in locations with clear views of the surrounding landscape, possibly tied to rituals involving rainfall, fertility, or agricultural cycles essential to early farming communities. Still others have proposed cylindrical or astronomical functions, suggesting the patterns may correspond to solar or lunar cycles. Though, much like similar claims made about other prehistoric sites, this interpretation remains difficult to confirm without more extensive comparative analysis across multiple carved surfaces. The sheer density and scale of the Cochno Stone's markings complicate all of these theories somewhat, because unlike smaller, more isolated cup and ring carvings found elsewhere, this site suggests either a single, sustained effort by one community across a significant span of time, or, more likely according to most researchers, a location returned to repeatedly across generations, with successive groups adding their own markings to a surface already considered significant by those who came before them. If that's accurate, the stone may represent less a single message and more an accumulated, layered record, one whose full meaning was never intended to be read all at once, and perhaps was never meant to be legible to anyone outside the community actively adding to it. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested the carvings might represent star maps, symbolic representations of the surrounding landscape, or even proto-writing of a kind not yet fully understood, though none of these theories currently carry the kind of broad academic support that would move them from possibility into consensus. The absence of any comparably dense, well-preserved site elsewhere in Britain makes comparative analysis difficult, leaving the Cochno Stone in a position similar to several other artifacts already explored in this collection. Extraordinary in scale, but resistant to full interpretation. Today, following its most recent excavation and documentation, the stone has once again been reburied, protected beneath a covering of soil and turf, its precise carvings preserved digitally through 3D scanning, even as the physical surface itself returns to the earth that concealed it for half a century. It's a strange kind of preservation, one that keeps the stone safe by keeping it hidden, accessible only through data and imagery, rather than direct, physical encounter. What were the builders of the Cochno Stone trying to record, mark, or communicate across the centuries they spent adding to its surface? Was this a shared ritual site, its meaning renewed and reinterpreted by each generation that visited it? Or does its true purpose remain buried more deeply than the soil currently covering it, lost somewhere in the layers of carving itself, added and overlapped by hands that left no other record of their intentions? For now, the stone rests quietly beneath the ground once more, its answers, if it ever truly held any, waiting in the dark for whoever eventually chooses to uncover them again. The Cochno Stone has returned to its quiet burial beneath the Scottish soil, its carvings preserved only in digital form. But not every ancient mystery hides beneath the ground. Some sit in glass display cases, in plain view, and still manage to raise questions no museum label has ever fully answered. Among them, a small collection of golden objects from the river valleys of west-central Colombia, crafted by a people whose metalworking skill remains, even now, difficult to fully explain. The Quimbaya, a pre-Columbian culture that flourished in the Cauca River Valley region between roughly the 4th and 10th centuries AD, are remembered today primarily through the remarkable gold artifacts their artisans left behind, discovered in burial sites throughout the region beginning in the late 19th century. Quimbaya goldwork is widely regarded by archaeologists and metallurgists as among the finest produced anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas, distinguished by its use of tumbaga, a gold-copper alloy that allowed for intricate detail, and by techniques including lost wax casting, capable of producing extraordinarily refined symmetrical forms. Among the hundreds of Quimbaya artifacts recovered and studied, one small group of objects has drawn attention far beyond typical archaeological interest. A set of golden figurines, generally between 2 and 4 inches in length, depicting sleek, elongated forms with distinct triangular fins, a pronounced central body, and features that some viewers have described as resembling delta-wing aircraft or, according to more speculative interpretations, futuristic flying vehicles far removed from anything associated with pre-Columbian artistic tradition. It's easy to understand why these particular figures have generated such persistent fascination. Held at certain angles, their proportions do bear a passing resemblance to modern aerodynamic design, a resemblance that has led some researchers, working largely outside mainstream archaeological consensus, to suggest the figurines might represent an inexplicably advanced understanding of aeronautics, or, in more fringe interpretations, evidence of ancient contact with technology far beyond what any pre-Columbian culture is believed to have possessed. Some proponents of these theories have gone so far as to construct scale models based on the figurines' proportions and test their aerodynamic properties, presenting the results as evidence supporting a deliberate, functional design. Mainstream archaeologists and art historians, however, offer a considerably more grounded explanation, one rooted firmly within the broader visual language of Quimbaya and neighboring Andean cultures. Zoomorphic imagery, stylized representations of animals rather than literal, detailed depictions, appears extensively throughout the region's goldwork, pottery, and ceremonial objects. Within this context, the so-called airplane figurines are generally interpreted as stylized depictions of birds, insects, bats, or in some analyses, flying fish, creatures common to the region's tropical environment and frequently featured throughout Andean cosmology, where flight often carried symbolic or spiritual significance tied to shamanic transformation and journeys between physical and spiritual realms. Comparative analysis lends considerable support to this interpretation. Similar stylized, elongated forms with wing-like or fin-like extensions appear throughout Quimbaya and broader pre-Columbian Andean iconography, often clearly identifiable as birds or insects when examined alongside less ambiguous examples from the same cultural tradition. Viewed within that wider artistic vocabulary, rather than isolated and compared instead to modern aircraft, the figurines fit reasonably well within an established, symbolic visual language rather than standing as inexplicable outliers. And yet, the resemblance that first caught public attention hasn't entirely faded from scholarly conversation either, if only as a reminder of how easily the human eye searches for familiar patterns across vast gaps of time and culture. Why do these particular figures, more than the countless other zoomorphic gold objects recovered from Quimbaya burial sites, so consistently draw comparisons to modern technology? Is it simply a matter of stylization pushed further than usual, abstracting animal forms until they inadvertently echo shapes we now associate with flight of an entirely different kind? Or does the persistence of the comparison suggest something about these specific artifacts that closer, more rigorous analysis has yet to fully account for? Complicating the picture further, precise provenance for many Quimbaya gold artifacts, including several of the so-called airplane figurines, has been difficult to establish. Extensive looting throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, combined with the private sale and international dispersal of numerous pieces before proper archaeological documentation could take place, means that some objects lack the detailed excavation context that might otherwise help settle debates over their exact age, original ceremonial function, or specific cultural meaning within Quimbaya society. What we're left with, then, is an artifact type that fits comfortably within known artistic tradition, according to the great majority of specialists who have studied it, and yet continues to invite comparison to something else entirely. A tension that says as much about the boundaries of ancient symbolic representation as it does about our own persistent desire to find hidden, advanced knowledge tucked within the art of the past. The figurines themselves remain on display in museums across Colombia and abroad, small and unassuming in scale, yet carrying a debate considerably larger than their size might suggest. Were they birds, insects, or fish, shaped by artisans working confidently within a visual language we simply haven't fully reconstructed? Or is there something about their particular form that still resists full explanation, caught somewhere between ancient symbolism and a resemblance modern eyes were never meant to notice? Perhaps the answer lies buried in some yet undiscovered example, one with clearer context, waiting somewhere along the riverbanks of the Kaka Valley to finally settle what these small golden figures were truly meant to represent. The golden figures of the Quimbaya remain behind their museum glass, their meaning unsettled, but at least anchored to a known culture and a known river valley. Not every artifact affords even that much certainty. Sometimes an object surfaces with no clear origin at all, pulled not from an excavation, but from the mud at the bottom of a lake, carrying questions that a century of study has never fully resolved. That's the case with a small, egg-shaped stone recovered from the depths of Lake Winnipesaukee in central New Hampshire. In 1872, workers were driving a post into the lakebed as part of a land-clearing operation near Meredith, New Hampshire, when, according to the account passed down through the family who owned the property, the effort brought up an unusual object buried several feet beneath the surface, embedded in blue clay far below the topsoil. The object was a dark, egg-shaped stone, roughly 4 inches long, carved from a type of quartzite not native to the immediate area, its surface covered in a series of engraved symbols. A face-like image, a spiral, an arrow, geometric lines, and small drilled holes that appear to have been created using some form of early tool. From the outset, the stone resisted easy classification. Its symbols didn't correspond clearly to any single, well-documented indigenous artistic or symbolic tradition known from the immediate region, though comparisons have been drawn over the years to broader Algonquian and other northeastern woodland indigenous iconography, as well as, in more speculative circles, to European medieval carving styles, and even, among a small number of fringe theorists, to symbols associated with far more distant cultures entirely. None of these comparisons has ever achieved anything close to scholarly consensus. The stone's depth of burial only deepened the puzzle. Objects found several feet beneath a lake bed, sealed within layers of clay that typically accumulate gradually over long spans of time, raise reasonable questions about age, questions that, in the absence of the kind of modern excavation documentation archaeologists rely on today, have never been definitively answered. The stone was recovered accidentally by workers engaged in an unrelated task, using 19th century tools and methods, with no scientific stratigraphic recording of exactly how or how deeply it had been buried, nor any surrounding artifacts recovered alongside it that might have helped establish a clearer chronological or cultural context. What we're left with, then, is largely secondhand testimony, a family account of the discovery, later examined and displayed by regional historical societies, without the kind of rigorous documentation that would allow modern researchers to independently verify the circumstances surrounding its recovery. Mainstream historians and archaeologists who have studied the Winnipesaukee stone generally lean toward interpreting it as a genuine indigenous artifact, quite possibly linked to Abenaki or other northeastern woodland peoples who inhabited the Lake Winnipesaukee region for thousands of years before European contact, potentially created for ceremonial, symbolic, or personal use, its precise function lost, along with whatever oral tradition might once have explained it. Under this interpretation, the stone's unusual depth of burial may simply reflect natural sediment accumulation and shifting lakebed conditions over centuries, rather than evidence of extraordinary age requiring a more exotic explanation. Other researchers working with more caution note that without controlled excavation records, any claim about the stone's precise age, whether several hundred years old or considerably older, remains difficult to support with confidence. The engraved face, in particular, has drawn comparisons to imagery found on artifacts from indigenous cultures across a fairly wide geographic range, spanning parts of the Northeast, and even extending, according to some comparative analyses, toward imagery documented among certain Mesoamerican cultures, comparisons that remain speculative and have not been substantiated through rigorous cross-cultural study. It's this gap between what the stone visually suggests and what can actually be verified through established archaeological method that has allowed more fringe theories to take root over the decades. Some have proposed the stone might represent evidence of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, pointing to certain symbols they interpret as bearing a resemblance to European alphabetic or numeric systems. a claim that has found no support within mainstream epigraphy and remains firmly outside accepted archaeological consensus. Others have suggested more ceremonial or astronomical purposes, proposing the spiral and drilled holes may have functioned as some kind of primitive calendar or ritual device, an interpretation that, like several others associated with this stone, remains plausible in theory but unconfirmed in practice. The Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone is preserved today at the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord, still displayed, still described using the same word that has followed it since 1872. Mystery. No conclusive dating has ever been performed using modern methods capable of definitively resolving its age. No clear cultural attribution has achieved full scholarly agreement. What was this small stone meant to represent, or to do? Was it a ceremonial object, carved by hands whose specific tradition has simply been lost to time, its meaning fully understood only by the community that created it? Or does its unusual burial depth and unclear symbolism suggest a story considerably older and considerably harder to explain than the region's known history currently accounts for? Somewhere in the archives of a small New Hampshire historical society, the stone sits quietly in its case, unchanged by more than a century of speculation, waiting for whatever combination of evidence or advanced analysis might one day finally settle the question its discovery first raised. The stone from Winnipesaukee keeps its silence in a glass case in Concord, but not every ancient object was built to be hidden. Some were built to be worn, raised high, catching sunlight in a way clearly meant to be seen from a distance. Among the strangest of these are a small handful of towering cone-shaped golden hats, unearthed across Central Europe, that appear to have served no practical purpose at all, at least not one grounded in anything we would call ordinary. Only 4 of these objects are known to survive today, discovered individually over the course of more than a century, at sites scattered across present-day Germany, France, and Switzerland. Known collectively as the Golden Hats, or sometimes the Golden Cone Hats, they date to the Late Bronze Age, roughly between 1400 and 800 BC, a period associated with the Urnfield culture, a broad archaeological tradition spread across much of Central Europe, named for its distinctive practice of cremating the dead and burying their ashes in flat urn fields. Each hat shares a similar basic form, a tall, narrow cone crafted from a single, remarkably thin sheet of gold, hammered with such precision that some examples measure less than a millimeter in thickness and yet remain structurally intact after nearly 3,000 years. The surfaces are covered edge to edge in intricate horizontal bands of embossed symbols, primarily circles, rosettes, and other repeating geometric motifs, arranged with an exactness that suggests careful, deliberate planning rather than casual decoration. The tallest of the 4, known as the Berlin Gold Hat, stands nearly 30 inches high and is covered in an estimated 1,700 individual embossed symbols, organized into distinct horizontal registers running the full length of the cone. Producing an object like this would have required exceptional skill in goldsmithing, along with a considerable investment of both material and time, raising an immediate and fairly obvious question. What could possibly justify that level of craftsmanship and expense in a Bronze Age society without industrial tools or mechanized production? The most widely supported answer, developed through comparative analysis across all 4 surviving hats, centers on astronomy. Researchers who have closely studied the arrangement of symbols on each cone have proposed that the repeating bands of circles and rosettes may represent a lunisolar calendar, a system used to reconcile the different cycles of the moon and the sun, allowing a society without written numerical systems to track agricultural or ceremonial timing across the year. Under this interpretation, the horizontal bands correspond to specific counts tied to lunar months, while other symbol groupings may reflect solar positioning throughout the year, functioning less as pure decoration and more as an extraordinarily elaborate portable wearable calculation device, encoding astronomical knowledge that would otherwise have to be memorized and transmitted verbally, generation after generation. If accurate, this interpretation would represent a genuinely remarkable level of astronomical sophistication for a late Bronze Age culture in Central Europe, one not typically credited with formalized calendrical systems as complex as those associated with, for example, ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt. And this is where more caution enters the conversation. While the calendrical interpretation has gained considerable support among researchers who specialize in this period, it remains, by most accounts, an informed reconstruction rather than a definitively proven fact. No accompanying written explanation survives to confirm the intended meaning of any specific symbol grouping, and the interpretation relies heavily on pattern analysis conducted well over 2,000 years after the objects were created, without direct testimony from the culture that produced them. There's also the matter of function, a question that remains in some ways even less settled than the meaning of the symbols themselves. Were these towering golden cones actually worn as hats, in the way their popular name suggests? Physical evidence offers limited certainty. Some of the surviving examples show damage or wear patterns near their base consistent with having been mounted or displayed rather than worn directly against the head for extended periods. And their extreme thinness, while a testament to remarkable craftsmanship, would have made them exceptionally fragile if subjected to regular physical wear. Some researchers propose the hats may have topped ceremonial staffs or poles rather than sitting atop human heads, functioning as processional or ritual objects, carried or displayed during specific religious or communal events rather than worn as clothing in the conventional sense. Adding to the uncertainty, the archaeological context surrounding several of the hats leaves considerable room for open questions. Some were discovered accidentally, decades or even centuries before modern excavation standards existed, with only partial documentation of their original burial conditions. The Schifferstadt gold cone, discovered in 1835 in southwestern Germany, was found alongside bronze axes, suggesting a ceremonial deposit likely connected to religious or votive practice. But even this relatively well-documented context leaves the object's precise ritual function open to interpretation rather than firm conclusion. Given how few examples exist and how limited direct evidence remains regarding their exact use, several theories continue to circulate alongside the dominant calendrical interpretation. Some researchers suggest the hats may have belonged exclusively to religious or priestly figures, serving as a visible marker of specialized astronomical or calendrical knowledge, a kind of symbolic authority tied to someone capable of interpreting the movements of the sun and moon on behalf of their community. Others propose a more purely ceremonial role, suggesting the elaborate symbolism may have carried spiritual or cosmological meaning that extended beyond practical timekeeping altogether, tied to beliefs about the sky, the cycle of seasons, or the relationship between the heavens and the community's sense of order, in ways that resist full reconstruction from the objects alone. What remains consistent across every theory, however, is the sheer improbability of the objects themselves. 4 surviving cones, each requiring extraordinary skill, material investment, and, if the calendrical interpretation holds, a level of astronomical observation not otherwise well documented among their contemporaries in late Bronze Age Central Europe. So the golden hats remain today, carefully preserved in museum collections across Germany and France, their thin surfaces still catching light in a way clearly designed by their makers to be seen, admired, and perhaps even instructive. Were they truly calendars, encoded in gold and worn to mark the passage of the seasons? Were they instead purely symbolic, expressions of religious authority whose full meaning existed only within a belief system now lost to us entirely? Or is it possible these objects served both purposes at once, sacred and practical simultaneously, in a culture that may never have drawn the same firm line between astronomy and religion that later societies would insist upon? Whatever the true answer, it remains folded somewhere within those thousands of small embossed symbols, pressed into gold nearly 3,000 years ago, by hands that left behind extraordinary craftsmanship, but no explanation. The golden hats of Central Europe held their secrets in the careful arrangement of hammered symbols, evidence of intention even where meaning remains uncertain. But not every mysterious object bears a mark of human craftsmanship so plainly. Some raise the far more basic question of whether human hands were involved at all. That question sits at the center of a small, unassuming set of stones pulled from mining deposits in South Africa that have puzzled and divided observers for decades. Known as the Klerksdorp Spheres, these objects take their name from the region near Klerksdorp, in what is now South Africa's northwest province, where miners working pyrophyllite deposits, a soft, easily carved mineral, began recovering small, rounded, disc-like objects during the mid-20th century. Estimates regarding the age of the surrounding sedimentary rock in which they were found range dramatically, with some geological assessments placing the deposits at roughly 3 billion years old, a figure that, if directly and reliably connected to the objects themselves, would place them well before the emergence of any known life capable of shaping stone with intention, let alone anything resembling human civilization. The spheres themselves are unremarkable in size, generally measuring only an inch or two in diameter, and are typically reddish-brown or bluish-gray in color. What has captured attention over the years isn't their size, but their form. Some examples are nearly perfectly spherical, while others display a distinct shallow groove encircling their equator, a feature some observers have compared to a manufactured seam, the kind one might expect from an object cast or machined using a mold, rather than something shaped purely by natural geological processes. For a small, dedicated group of researchers and enthusiasts, this apparent precision, combined with the extraordinary age attributed to the surrounding rock, has suggested something extraordinary. Evidence of intentional, tool-based manufacturing dating back not thousands, but potentially billions of years, long before any known tool-making species existed on Earth. Some proponents of this view have gone further, framing the spheres as possible evidence of contact with, or activity by, an intelligence entirely outside conventional human history, whether ancient and unrecorded, or, in more speculative interpretations, extraterrestrial in origin. It's an interpretation that understandably generates fascination, and it's also one that mainstream geologists and mineralogists who have examined the spheres directly have consistently pushed back against, offering a considerably more grounded, if less dramatic, explanation rooted in known natural processes. According to geological analysis, the Klerksdorp Spheres are most likely a naturally occurring type of formation known as a concretion, sometimes more specifically classified, based on their composition and structure, as a variety of natural mineral nodule formed through a process geologists refer to as accretion, where mineral material gradually accumulates in layers around a central nucleus, often a small grain, fossil fragment, or other tiny irregularity buried within sediment long before it hardened into solid rock. Over enormous spans of geological time, mineral-rich water moving through porous sediment can deposit material in increasingly symmetrical rounded layers, a process well documented at concretion sites around the world, capable of producing remarkably smooth, sometimes strikingly spherical formations, entirely without any human or otherwise intelligent involvement. The equatorial groove that some observers interpret as evidence of manufacturing has its own, more conventional explanation as well. Geologists studying similar concretions elsewhere have noted that this kind of banding or grooved seam can occur naturally, often resulting from slight compositional differences within the layered mineral structure. Differences that create a visible ridge or groove as the object weathers, or occasionally forms, along a natural plane of structural weakness within the concretion itself. Similar grooved, spherical concretions have been documented at other sites around the world, in contexts with no connection whatsoever to the Klerksdorp mining region, lending considerable support to the natural formation explanation. Then there is the matter of the widely cited age. While it's true that some of the sedimentary deposits in the broader region have been geologically dated to billions of years old, critics of the more extraordinary interpretations point out that this age applies to the surrounding rock formation as a whole, not necessarily to definitive controlled dating of the spheres themselves under rigorous scientific conditions. Establishing a secure and specific age for an individual small object recovered during mining operations, often without detailed excavation documentation regarding its precise stratigraphic position, is considerably more complicated than simply citing the broadest known age of the regional geological formation. Several of the researchers who have examined the spheres directly have noted that a confirmed, direct dating study specifically targeting the objects themselves, isolated from the general age of the surrounding rock layer, has never been conclusively published in peer-reviewed geological literature. This gap between the popular claims that have circulated for decades and the more limited, cautious findings actually available in scientific literature is where much of the enduring fascination with the Klerksdorp Spheres continues to live. Most geologists who have studied comparable formations consider the natural concretion explanation sufficient, consistent with well-understood mineral processes documented at numerous sites worldwide, requiring no unconventional explanation to account for either their shape or their grooved surface. And yet, the spheres continue to circulate in more speculative circles as potential evidence of something considerably stranger. An object seemingly too precise for its claimed age, discovered in a manner that left little opportunity for the kind of rigorous documentation that might have settled the matter conclusively from the very beginning. Several examples of the Klerksdorp Spheres are held today in South African museum collections, alongside private collections scattered elsewhere in the world, still occasionally examined, still generating renewed interest whenever the subject resurfaces in documentaries, articles, or online discussion. Are these small rounded stones simply an unusually striking but ultimately explainable product of natural mineral accretion, formed slowly across unimaginable spans of geological time? Or does their apparent symmetry, and the depth at which some were recovered, suggest something about their origin that current geological understanding has not yet fully accounted for? Perhaps, much like several other objects examined throughout this collection, the true answer lies not in a dramatic reversal of scientific consensus, but in the far more ordinary and yet still remarkable patience of the natural world, capable of producing forms so precise that centuries later we still find ourselves questioning whether nature alone could truly be responsible. The Klerksdorp Spheres return us in the end to the patient, unhurried logic of the natural world. But not every marked stone allows for so tidy a resolution. Deep in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, a large soapstone outcrop bears markings whose origin no one disputes. Human hands, deliberately carved, and whose meaning, even so, has never been fully agreed upon by the very people whose ancestors most likely made them. Known as Judaculla Rock, the site sits in a quiet valley near the town of Cullowhee, within the traditional homeland of the Cherokee people. The rock itself is a large, sloped outcrop of soapstone, its surface covered in several hundred carved petroglyphs, an intricate, densely layered collection of lines, circles, human-like figures, and abstract shapes, believed by most archaeologists to have been created over a considerable span of time, potentially spanning centuries, or even longer, based on the varying styles and apparent overlap visible among different carvings across the surface. Unlike several of the more isolated or obscure artifacts explored elsewhere in this collection, Judaculla Rock benefits from something relatively rare among ancient petroglyphs: a living cultural tradition directly connected to its meaning. The Cherokee name for the site translates roughly to Devil's Courthouse in some historical accounts, though the more accurate underlying tradition centers on Judaculla, or Tzulkalu in the Cherokee language, a powerful slant-eyed giant figure from Cherokee oral tradition, said to have ruled over the surrounding mountains and hunting grounds, leaving his handprint, and according to some versions of the story, his footprints, upon the rock itself as he leapt from the surrounding peaks. This continuity, oral tradition still actively connecting a specific cultural figure to the physical site itself, sets Judaculla Rock apart from many ancient petroglyph sites around the world, where the original meaning has been entirely severed from any living cultural memory. And yet, even with this connection intact, the specific meaning behind many of the individual carvings covering the rock's surface remains, in a very real sense, still unresolved. Cherokee oral tradition identifies the site as sacred, closely tied to Tzulkalu and to spiritual practices historically associated with the surrounding landscape. But it does not, at least based on currently documented accounts, provide a specific symbol-by-symbol translation of every individual carving covering the rock's dense and layered surface. Some marks are relatively easy to interpret within the framework of this broader tradition. Deep depressions sometimes associated with the giant's handprint, for example, align naturally with the story passed down through generations. But many of the surrounding lines, circles, and more abstract figures resist such straightforward interpretation, and it remains genuinely unclear, even among Cherokee cultural historians and outside archaeologists working collaboratively on the site, whether these additional markings represent a single, coherent narrative, multiple unrelated messages added by different individuals across a long span of time, or symbolic content whose specific meaning was simply never intended to be universally legible, understood fully only by specific individuals within the community who created and maintained the tradition surrounding the site. Formal archaeological survey work, conducted more thoroughly beginning in the early 2000s through a collaborative effort involving Western Carolina University and Cherokee cultural historians, used detailed 3D scanning technology to document the rock's surface with far greater precision than earlier hand-drawn surveys had achieved, revealing considerably more carvings, some faint, overlapping, or otherwise difficult to detect with the naked eye, than had been previously recorded. This more detailed documentation confirmed what many researchers had already suspected, that the rock's carvings likely represent contributions made across a broad span of time by multiple individuals, rather than a single unified composition created all at once by one artist working from one complete design. If that's accurate, and it remains the interpretation with the strongest current support, then Judaculla rock functions less like a single message meant to be read from beginning to end, and more like a continuously maintained sacred site, returned to repeatedly across generations, its surface gradually accumulating new carvings, the same way certain oral traditions accumulate new details with each retelling, each contribution adding to a body of significance without necessarily requiring every individual mark to carry equal, universally legible weight. Some more speculative interpretations, circulating primarily outside mainstream archaeological or Cherokee cultural scholarship, have proposed that specific carvings on the rock may encode astronomical information, calendrical markers, or even alignments related to solstice observation. Comparisons occasionally drawn, loosely and without rigorous supporting analysis, to other petroglyph traditions found elsewhere in the world. These theories remain largely unverified and are not generally supported by the archaeologists and Cherokee cultural historians most directly engaged in ongoing study of the site, though the sheer density and apparent intentionality of the carvings has made such comparisons difficult to entirely dismiss out of hand, if only because so much of the rock's surface still resists confident, complete interpretation, even by those working closest to its cultural context. There's something worth sitting with in that distinction, a mystery that persists not because a culture's connection to a sacred site was severed and lost, as with so many other ancient artifacts, but because even an intact, living tradition doesn't always provide a complete key to every mark left behind by those who came before. Oral tradition preserves meaning, but it doesn't necessarily preserve everything, particularly across carvings potentially added by many different individuals, for many different, and possibly deeply personal or specific ceremonial reasons, over a span of time considerably longer than any single lifetime. Judaculla rock remains today protected as a North Carolina historic site, still visited, still respected by the Cherokee community whose ancestors most likely created much of its surface, and still, in certain sections, genuinely unexplained even by those with the deepest cultural connection to its meaning. What was recorded across those hundreds of carvings, added slowly across generations. Was each new mark a continuation of the same sacred narrative connected to Sulkalu? Or did the rock eventually become something broader, a canvas for many different individual purposes, tied together only by the shared belief that this particular place held significance worth adding to? And how much of that original meaning, even within a tradition that has survived remarkably intact compared to so many other ancient sites, has nonetheless quietly slipped away, carried off by time, and by the individual voices of carvers whose specific intentions were simply never written down? Perhaps some of that meaning still exists, held quietly within Cherokee oral tradition, waiting for the right conversation, the right question, or the right generation to bring it fully back into the light. Judaculla rock keeps its accumulated carvings under Cherokee stewardship, a tradition still partly intact even where full understanding has slipped away. Deep in the rainforests of northern Guatemala, another discovery raises a related but distinct question. Not what happens when meaning is only partially preserved, but what happens when an entire sophisticated tradition is found fully formed, far earlier than anyone expected it to exist. The site is known as San Bartolo, a remote Maya archaeological complex buried beneath dense jungle in the Petén region of Guatemala, rediscovered by archaeologists in 2001 after decades of being known only to looters and local guides. What drew serious academic attention wasn't the site's pyramids or plazas, structures common enough throughout the Maya world, but a small, hidden chamber deep within one of its earliest structures, where archaeologist William Saturno and his team uncovered a set of vividly painted murals that would eventually reshape long-standing assumptions about the timeline of Maya civilization. The murals, found within a structure now designated as Las Pinturas, have been dated to approximately 100 BC, placing them firmly within the pre-classic period of Maya history, a phase of Mesoamerican civilization long considered, prior to this discovery, to be comparatively simple in terms of religious iconography, political organization, and artistic sophistication, especially when measured against the later classic period, roughly 250 to 900 AD, which produced the towering temples and elaborate court art most commonly associated with Maya civilization in the popular imagination. What the San Bartolo murals revealed instead was a religious and mythological system already remarkably complex, fully developed, and visually sophisticated, centuries before most scholars believed such complexity had emerged. The paintings depict a richly detailed cosmological narrative, including scenes generally interpreted as representing the Maya creation story, gods associated with maize, wind, and rain, along with a ritual bloodletting scene and depictions of a royal accession ceremony, ordering a king ascending to power under the sanction and authority of the gods, painted with a level of narrative complexity and refined artistic technique that most researchers had assumed belonged exclusively to a much later, more developed stage of Maya civilization. This is where the mainstream archaeological significance of the discovery becomes clear, and also where it opens into more difficult, still unresolved questions. If the pre-classic Maya were already capable of producing religious narrative art this developed, this early, what does that suggest about the actual pace and timeline of Maya civilization's political and religious evolution? Was Maya civilization's core cosmology, kingship rituals, and artistic conventions established considerably earlier than the archaeological record had previously suggested, only later expressed on a grander architectural scale during the Classic period? Or does the sophistication of the San Bartolo murals represent something more unusual, a localized, unusually advanced tradition that may not necessarily reflect the broader pre-classic Maya world at large? Most Maya specialists lean toward the first interpretation, viewing San Bartolo as compelling evidence that the ideological and religious foundations of Maya civilization, particularly concepts of divine kingship and the core mythological narratives later depicted throughout the Classic period, were already substantially in place far earlier than previously assumed, simply awaiting the population growth, resource accumulation, and political consolidation that would eventually allow later Maya society to express these same ideas through monumental architecture and large-scale public art. But the murals raise more specific, harder-to-answer questions as well, particularly regarding the glyphs found accompanying several of the painted scenes. Some of the hieroglyphic captions at San Bartolo represent among the earliest examples of Maya writing ever discovered, and several of these glyphs remain only partially deciphered, or in some cases, not confidently deciphered at all, using the same broader system of Maya hieroglyphic decipherment that researchers have successfully applied to inscriptions from later, better documented periods. Does this difficulty stem simply from the practical challenges of interpreting an early, still evolving version of a writing system that would only become more standardized in later centuries? Or does it suggest that certain specific concepts, terms, or ritual vocabulary present within this particular pre-classic tradition may not directly correspond to later, more fully documented classic Maya religious and political terminology, representing ideas or practices that shifted or were reinterpreted as Maya civilization itself continued to evolve. There's also the matter of preservation, and what it might suggest about the broader archaeological record. The San Bartolo murals survived largely because the structure containing them was deliberately buried beneath later construction, a common Maya practice involving the ritual interment of earlier buildings beneath newer ones, a practice that, while well documented elsewhere, raises an intriguing possibility specific to this case. How many other similarly sophisticated pre-classic murals might exist, buried beneath later Maya structures throughout the region, still completely unknown to modern archaeology, simply because no one has yet had reason to excavate deeply enough beneath a later temple to find them? This question carries real weight within Maya archaeology, specifically because San Bartolo was found essentially by accident, discovered only when Saturno, initially investigating a completely unrelated site nearby, took shelter from the rain inside a looter's tunnel and noticed a small fragment of painted plaster exposed along the tunnel wall. Had that tunnel not existed, had that particular afternoon rain shower not sent him seeking shelter in precisely that spot, the murals might easily have remained unknown for decades, or centuries, longer, buried beneath a mound indistinguishable, on the surface, from countless other unexcavated structures scattered throughout the Maya lowlands. The murals themselves remain protected within the site today, painstakingly conserved due to their extraordinary fragility, studied continuously by researchers working to further refine both their artistic interpretation and the glyphic captions accompanying them. How much of Maya civilization's earliest religious and political framework remains buried, quite literally, beneath later construction throughout the jungles of Peten, still unknown simply because no accidental tunnel, no unexpected rain shower has yet led researchers to the right hidden chamber. And if San Bartolo represents an early tradition already this fully formed, this early, what does that suggest about how much we still don't know regarding the true origins of ideas we've long associated exclusively with Maya civilization's later, more visible golden age? Perhaps the answer isn't buried beneath a single mound at all, but scattered across dozens of unexcavated structures throughout the Maya lowlands, each one a potential Las Pinturas, waiting for its own accidental discovery to rewrite, once again, what we think we already understand. The murals of San Bartolo remind us that extraordinary discoveries sometimes emerge from nothing more than an accidental tunnel and an unexpected rainstorm. But not every claimed discovery arrives with the same kind of verifiable circumstance or the same willingness to allow full independent access to what was found. In the wooded hill country of southeastern Illinois, one such claim has circulated for more than 4 decades, centered on a cave that few researchers outside a small dedicated circle have ever been permitted to see for themselves. The story begins in 1982, when a man named Russell Burrows claimed to have discovered a network of underground tunnels and chambers near Olney, Illinois, containing hundreds of engraved stone tablets, statuettes, and other artifacts bearing what he described as ancient inscriptions, some resembling Egyptian hieroglyphics, others compared to scripts associated with various ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures, along with depictions of figures Burrows and his supporters interpreted as bearded, non-indigenous individuals. Imagery, they suggested, pointed toward some form of ancient transoceanic contact between Old World civilizations and pre-Columbian North America. If genuine, a discovery of this scale and character would represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, potentially reshaping long-held assumptions about pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and cultures from across the Atlantic. It's a claim substantial enough that, in the years following Burrows' initial announcement, it drew considerable attention from both fringe researchers eager to investigate further and mainstream archaeologists skeptical of a discovery that, from the very beginning, came with unusual and persistent limitations on independent access. That access issue sits at the very center of the Burrows Cave controversy, and it's difficult to discuss the artifacts without addressing it directly. Despite decades having passed since the initial claim, no professional archaeologist has ever been permitted to conduct a formal, independently verified excavation of the cave's actual location. Burrows himself provided shifting or incomplete details regarding the site's exact whereabouts over the years, citing concerns about looting or unwanted attention. And while a number of artifacts attributed to the cave have circulated among private collectors and researchers, no controlled in-situ excavation, the kind of documented, professionally supervised recovery process considered standard practice for any legitimate archaeological claim, has ever taken place. This absence has left researchers largely dependent on examining individual artifacts after the fact, disconnected from any verified excavation context, a situation considerably different from virtually every other site explored throughout this collection, where at least some baseline of documented professional archaeological process exists, even amid ongoing interpretive debate. Several of the artifacts that have circulated publicly, examined by both independent researchers and, in a smaller number of cases, professional epigraphers and archaeologists willing to evaluate photographs or physical samples, have raised significant concerns. Some inscriptions bear resemblances to multiple historically unrelated ancient scripts simultaneously, combinations that specialists in ancient writing systems have described as inconsistent with any known coherent linguistic tradition, more closely resembling an amalgamation of symbols copied or adapted from widely available reference books on ancient writing, rather than an internally consistent script developed organically by a genuine ancient culture. Material analysis conducted on a small number of available artifacts has, in certain cases, suggested manufacturing techniques and material compositions inconsistent with the extreme antiquity claimed for the objects, findings that have led a considerable portion of the professional archaeological community to treat the broader Burrows cave claim with substantial skepticism, if not outright dismissal, as an elaborate modern fabrication. Burrows and his supporters have offered various explanations for these inconsistencies over the years, along with continued assertions that broader recognition has been deliberately withheld due to institutional resistance toward evidence that would challenge conventional archaeological timelines regarding pre-Columbian contact. This argument that mainstream archaeology reflexively rejects any evidence contradicting established consensus is one that surfaces periodically across several fringe archaeological claims, and it remains, on its own, difficult to evaluate independently of the actual physical evidence involved, since the claim itself doesn't resolve the specific, documented inconsistencies raised by researchers who have examined the available artifacts directly. What makes the Burrows cave case particularly difficult to definitively close, even amid this substantial skepticism, is precisely the same issue that initially fueled the controversy: the continued absence of verified access to the original site. Without a professionally documented excavation, independent researchers remain unable to either fully confirm or fully dismiss the broader claim through direct examination of the location itself, leaving the debate largely confined to analysis of the individual artifacts that have circulated outside any controlled archaeological context. This case differs meaningfully from others explored throughout this collection, where the Tărtăria Tablets or the Pokotia Monolith invite genuine scholarly uncertainty rooted in limited but verifiable archaeological context. The Burrows cave claim exists almost entirely outside that kind of verifiable framework altogether, a situation that leads the significant majority of professional archaeologists to categorize it not as an unresolved mystery in the same sense as other cases, but rather as an unverified and likely fabricated claim that has nonetheless persisted for decades within certain circles interested in alternative archaeological theories. And yet, the claim persists, in part because the alternative, a modern individual fabricating hundreds of artifacts across multiple invented ancient traditions with enough internal consistency to sustain interest for more than 40 years, is its own kind of unresolved question, less about ancient history, and more about the persistent human appetite for discoveries that challenge established narratives, regardless of the evidence available to support them. The cave, if it exists at all in the form originally described, remains unlocated by anyone outside Burrows's own account. The artifacts continue to circulate among private collectors, occasionally resurfacing in documentaries and online discussions eager to revisit the case. Was there ever a genuine underground chamber, hidden somewhere in the hills of southeastern Illinois, holding evidence of contact between ancient Old World cultures and pre-Columbian North America? Or does this case ultimately belong less to the archaeological record and more to the far more human history of belief, persistence, and the stories we sometimes choose to tell, regardless of what the physical evidence is actually able to support. Perhaps in this particular case, the deepest mystery isn't what lies buried in the ground at all, but why a claim built on so little verifiable foundation continues to hold the attention it does, more than 4 decades after it first surfaced. The Burrows cave leaves behind a very different kind of uncertainty, one rooted less in evidence than in the absence of it. There is, at least, no such problem with the next object in our exploration. It has never been hidden, never required a controversial excavation, and has sat in plain view along a riverbank in southeastern Massachusetts for as long as European settlers have kept written records of the region at all. And still, after more than 3 centuries of formal study, it remains one of the longest-running unresolved puzzles in North American archaeology. The object is a large boulder, roughly 40 tons in weight, resting along the eastern shore of the Taunton River near the town of Berkeley, Massachusetts. Known today as Dighton Rock, its exposed face is covered in a dense, overlapping series of carved lines, geometric shapes, and abstract figures, some clearly ancient, others added, altered, or reinforced by later visitors over the centuries, creating a surface so layered with markings from different periods that separating original content from later additions has proven to be one of the central, ongoing challenges of the entire case. European colonists in the region began documenting the rock's inscriptions as early as the late 17th century, and by the 18th century, the markings had already attracted the attention of antiquarians and early American scholars curious about their origin. This alone makes Dighton Rock somewhat unusual among the mysteries explored throughout this collection. Rather than being freshly discovered and analyzed using modern archaeological techniques from the outset, Dighton Rock has been examined, copied, interpreted, and reinterpreted continuously for well over 300 years, generating an extraordinarily long paper trail of competing theories, many of which reflect as much about the intellectual assumptions of the era that produced them as they do about the markings themselves. The most straightforward, and today most widely accepted, explanation situates the rock's carvings within a broader tradition of indigenous petroglyphs found throughout the Northeast, likely created by Algonquian-speaking peoples native to the region, quite possibly the Wampanoag, whose traditional homeland encompasses the area surrounding the Taunton River. Under this interpretation, the markings represent genuine, if difficult to fully translate, indigenous rock art, potentially created over a considerable span of time by different individuals for reasons that may have included territorial marking, spiritual or ceremonial purposes, or the kind of accumulated communally significant site marking process observed at other petroglyph locations already explored throughout this collection, including Judaculla Rock in North Carolina. That explanation, grounded in comparative indigenous archaeology and generally supported by the majority of professional archaeologists who have studied the site in recent decades, might have settled the matter entirely, if not for the sheer number of alternative theories the rock has attracted since the earliest colonial period, several of which continue to circulate today with varying degrees of scholarly and public support. Among the earliest alternative theories, dating back to the 1830s, was a proposal connecting the rock's markings to Norse exploration, suggesting the inscriptions might represent evidence of Viking presence in the region centuries before Columbus, potentially even referencing the semi-legendary Norse explorer Thorfinn Karlsefni, whose sagas describe voyages to a region some researchers have speculatively associated with the New England coastline. Proponents of this interpretation pointed to certain carved elements they believed resembled Norse runic characters, though this comparison has never achieved broad acceptance among specialists in either Norse runology or North American archaeology, and most researchers today consider the runic resemblance largely coincidental, a product of pattern recognition applied to worn, overlapping carvings rather than a genuine, verifiable script. A separate and, for a time, remarkably persistent theory emerged in the 19th century connecting the rock to Portuguese exploration, specifically to the navigator Miguel Corte-Real, who some researchers proposed may have carved a Latin inscription into the rock's surface around 1511, following a shipwreck along the New England coast. This theory gained enough traction that a bronze plaque referencing the Court Royale interpretation was installed near the site decades ago, an installation that today stands less as settled historical fact and more as a monument to just how seriously this particular explanation was once taken, despite the considerable difficulty later researchers have had in verifying any Latin script within the rock's heavily worn and overlapping carvings. Why has a single rock managed to attract such a wide and, at times, contradictory range of interpretations, stretching from indigenous petroglyphs to Norse runes to Portuguese Latin inscriptions? Part of the answer lies in the rock's own physical condition. Centuries of exposure to weathering, tidal water from the Taunton River, and repeated human interference, including by some accounts deliberate efforts by earlier researchers to deepen or trace over certain markings in order to make them easier to photograph or copy, have left the surface considerably degraded and difficult to interpret with full confidence. Early illustrations and rubbings of the rock, made by different researchers across different centuries, sometimes show substantial variation in how specific markings were rendered, raising legitimate questions about how much of what later theorists analyzed reflected the rock's original ancient carvings, and how much reflected accumulated interference, degradation, and interpretive bias introduced by well-meaning but imprecise documentation methods used long before modern imaging technology existed. Modern researchers working with more advanced photographic and scanning techniques have generally moved away from the Norse and Portuguese theories, both of which rely heavily on subjective visual interpretation of specific worn sections, rather than clear, independently verifiable script. The indigenous petroglyph interpretation has, by contrast, gained considerably more support in recent decades, bolstered by comparative analysis with other confirmed petroglyph sites throughout the Northeast, several of which display similar geometric and figural carving styles created using comparable stone working techniques. And yet, even with this modern consensus leaning firmly toward indigenous origin, complete certainty remains elusive for reasons that echo challenges seen throughout other cases explored in this collection. No definitive, universally accepted translation of the rock's specific symbols has been established, even among researchers who agree on its broad indigenous origin. Without a fully intact, undisturbed original surface, and without a complete, continuous oral tradition specifically tied to this particular rock's exact markings, in the way Cherokee tradition remains connected to Judaculla rock, researchers are left working with an interpretation that is well supported in general terms, while still incomplete in its specific details. There's also a broader, more reflective question the case raises, one that extends beyond Dighton rock itself. How much of what we consider settled archaeological interpretation is shaped not purely by the physical evidence, but by the cultural assumptions of whichever era happens to be doing the interpreting? The Norse and Portuguese theories that once seemed credible enough to warrant permanent bronze plaques weren't proposed in a vacuum. They emerged from 19th century academic and cultural contexts eager, for various reasons, to identify evidence of pre-Columbian European contact within American archaeology. Recognizing how thoroughly those earlier interpretations have since been set aside doesn't necessarily invalidate current scholarly consensus favoring indigenous origin, a conclusion that rests on considerably stronger comparative evidence than either historical alternative ever provided, but it does offer a useful reminder that even long-accepted interpretations of ancient markings can shift considerably as new comparative evidence, new technology, and new generations of researchers bring fresh eyes to material that has sat largely unchanged for centuries. Dighton Rock is preserved today within Dighton Rock State Park, protected inside a museum structure built specifically to shield it from further weathering, its carved surface still visible to visitors, still bearing the layered, overlapping evidence of more than 300 years of human curiosity, interpretation, and, at times, well-intentioned interference. What did the original carvers intend when they first marked this riverside boulder, centuries before any European colonist arrived to document, copy, or reinterpret their work? Was this a single, sustained tradition, maintained and added to by a specific indigenous community over successive generations, similar to what researchers have proposed at other petroglyph sites throughout the region? Or does the sheer density and apparent inconsistency of the carvings suggest something closer to what was found at Judaculla Rock, a site returned to repeatedly by different hands across a span of time long enough that no single unified narrative was ever intended to emerge from its surface at all? And perhaps most enduringly, how much of the rock's original meaning was lost not through the passage of centuries alone, but through the accumulated layers of interpretation added by well-meaning researchers who, in their eagerness to solve the mystery, may have inadvertently made the original markings even harder to fully recover. The Taunton River continues to rise and fall along the base of the rock, much as it has for thousands of years, indifferent to the centuries of theories built upon the marks along its surface, waiting, perhaps, for whatever future technology or comparative discovery might finally offer the clarity that 300 years of dedicated study has not yet been able to provide. The Taunton River continues its slow rhythm past Dighton Rock, a mystery scaled to the size of a single boulder along a single riverbank. But not every ancient puzzle can be taken in from one vantage point or photographed within a single frame. Some are so vast that their true form was invisible to human eyes for centuries, only becoming apparent from altitudes the people who built them may never have reached. That is the case on the high, wind-scoured plains surrounding Sajama, a dormant volcano in western Bolivia, where the ground itself has been etched with tens of thousands of lines, forming a network so extensive that its full scale wasn't properly understood until the age of aerial photography. The Sajama lines, as they're generally known, spread across a broad expanse of the Bolivian Altiplano, radiating outward from central points in long, straight paths that stretch for miles across the high-altitude terrain surrounding the volcano. Created by clearing away the region's dark surface stones to expose the lighter soil beneath, a technique broadly similar to methods used in other well-known geoglyph traditions found elsewhere in South America, the lines are believed to have been constructed over a considerable span of time, likely beginning sometime during the pre-Columbian era and, according to some researchers, potentially continuing to be maintained or added to well into more recent centuries, making Sajama one of the more difficult sites in this collection to assign a single, confident date of origin. What makes the Sajama network particularly striking beyond its age is its sheer scale. Researchers estimate the total length of the combined lines at several thousand miles, spread across an area considerably larger than more widely recognized geoglyph sites in the region, a fact that remained difficult to fully appreciate until aerial surveys and, more recently, satellite imagery allowed researchers to observe the full network from above. Walking the plains at ground level, a visitor might notice individual lines crossing the landscape, long, straight, deliberate, but the true scope of the network, its radiating patterns, its interconnected points, and its sheer geographic extent only becomes clear from a perspective the original builders, working without any equivalent aerial vantage point of their own, could never have directly observed. That fact alone raises one of the central questions surrounding Sajama, and one that echoes similar debates surrounding other geoglyph traditions found elsewhere in South America, most notably the more widely known Nazca lines to the south in Peru. How and why would a culture invest such enormous sustained labor into creating a network of markings whose full pattern could only be appreciated from an altitude no one on the ground could reach? Mainstream archaeological interpretation generally approaches this question by setting aside the assumption that the lines were necessarily meant to be viewed and understood as a complete network from above at all. Instead, researchers studying the Sajama lines and comparable Andean geoglyph traditions have proposed that the lines likely functioned as ritual pathways, walked and maintained by local communities as part of religious or ceremonial practice, rather than as a message or design intended for observation from a bird's eye or otherwise elevated perspective. Under this interpretation, the significance of the lines lies not in their overall visual pattern, but in the act of walking them, a form of ritual pilgrimage connecting specific sacred points across the landscape, including, in many documented cases, the towering snow-capped peak of Sajama itself, long considered a sacred mountain, or Apu, within Andean spiritual tradition, believed to hold power over weather, water, and the fertility of the surrounding land. This interpretation finds considerable support in the broader context of Andean spiritual geography, where mountains, water sources, and other significant natural landmarks are frequently connected through networks of shrines, pathways, and ritual sites, sometimes referred to using the Andean term Psique, a system most extensively documented around the Inca capital of Cusco, where a network of sacred lines and shrines radiated outward from the city's central temple, organizing both physical movement and religious practice across the surrounding landscape. If the Sajama lines represent a similar, though independently developed expression of this broader Andean tradition of connecting sacred points across long distances through deliberately maintained pathways, their function may have had considerably less to do with visual communication and considerably more to do with ongoing, physically embodied religious practice, walked and reinforced by generations of local communities across a span of time considerably longer than any single construction project would typically require. And yet, even accepting this general framework, specific questions about the Sajama network remain difficult to fully resolve. The sheer number of lines and the complexity of their intersecting, radiating patterns raises questions about coordination and planning that extend beyond what a single, localized ritual practice might necessarily require. Some researchers have noted that certain lines appear to align with specific points on the horizon associated with solstice or equinox sunrise and sunset positions, echoing similar archaeoastronomical claims made about the Nazca lines and various other ancient sites already explored throughout this collection. As with those other cases, formal, rigorous archaeoastronomical survey work at Sajama remains more limited than researchers might prefer, given the site's enormous scale and relatively remote location, leaving these specific alignment claims in a familiar, unresolved position. Plausible, occasionally compelling, but not yet confirmed through the kind of comprehensive, peer-reviewed analysis that would move the interpretation from possibility into established consensus. There's also the matter of the network's apparent longevity. Unlike more geographically confined sites explored elsewhere in this collection, evidence suggests the Sajama lines may have been created, maintained, and potentially expanded across a span of time considerably longer than a single cultural period, potentially beginning under one Andean cultural tradition and continuing to be used, reinforced, or added to under later Inca administration, given the region's confirmed incorporation into the broader Inca road and ritual network prior to European contact. If accurate, this would suggest the lines function less as a single, completed project and more as a living, evolving ritual landscape, continuously reshaped by successive generations and, potentially, successive political and religious authorities, each interpreting and reusing the same sacred pathways according to their own evolving traditions. This raises a genuinely open question that distinguishes Sajama somewhat from other cases in this collection. Is it even accurate to speak of the Sajama lines as a single unified mystery with one origin and one intended meaning, or would it be more precise to think of the network as a palimpsest, a landscape marked, remarked, and reinterpreted repeatedly across centuries, its current form representing an accumulation of purpose rather than a single, original design? Modern researchers continue to study the network using increasingly sophisticated satellite and remote sensing technology, work that has helped map the full extent of the lines with far greater precision than earlier ground-based surveys allowed. But this improved mapping has, so far, raised as many new questions as it has resolved. Why do certain sections of the network appear denser or more precisely maintained than others? Do specific clusters of lines correspond to specific historical periods of use, distinguishable through careful archaeological excavation at key intersection points? Work that remains, at present, considerably less extensive than the scale of the site would ultimately require to fully answer these questions. The volcano of Sajama itself continues to stand at the center of this vast network, snow-capped and largely unchanged, much as it likely appeared to the earliest communities who began tracing lines across the surrounding plains centuries, or perhaps millennia, ago. The lines radiating outward from its base remain walkable today, silent evidence of sustained ritual practice whose full meaning, much like the network's true visual scale, may have always exceeded what any single generation, standing at ground level, could ever fully perceive on their own. Was this landscape shaped by a single coherent religious vision, its purpose understood clearly by everyone who walked its pathways in service of the sacred mountain at its center? Or did meaning shift gradually across centuries of use, layered and reinterpreted by successive communities, until the network became less a message with one clear author and more a living record of accumulated devotion, its individual chapters no longer fully separable from one another? Perhaps, much like the mountain the lines were built to honor, the true purpose of the Sajama network was never meant to be observed all at once, but rather understood slowly, step by step, walked rather than seen, by generations who never needed the view from above to understand exactly where they were going, or why. The lines radiating from Sajama were built to be walked, not viewed, their meaning tied to movement across a landscape rather than to any single object that could be lifted, examined, or placed behind glass. The next chapter of our exploration returns to something more contained, and yet no less unsettling. A set of faces, cast in bronze and gold, deliberately broken and buried by the very people who made them, in a river valley in southwestern China that would keep their secret for more than 3,000 years. The site is Sanxingdui, meaning 3-star mounds, located in China's Sichuan province, along the banks of the Yazi River near the modern city of Guang'an. The name refers to 3 earthen mounds long visible on the site, which local legend once described as handfuls of soil cast down by a heavenly emperor, but which archaeologists have since identified as the remains of an ancient city wall, later built over and obscured by accumulated earth. The first hint that something significant lay beneath this unassuming landscape came in 1929, when a farmer repairing a sewage ditch uncovered a cache of jade and stone artifacts, objects that drew some early scholarly interest but gave little indication of the scale of what still remained hidden underground. That scale became unmistakable in 1986, when construction workers accidentally uncovered 2 sacrificial pits containing more than 1,000 artifacts, deliberately broken, burned, and buried together in what appeared to be a single, ritualized event. Bronze heads, ceremonial masks, gold foil ornaments, jade blades, ivory tusks, and cast bronze trees stood among the finds, pulled from the earth in fragments that archaeologists then spent years painstakingly reassembling. Since that initial discovery, continued excavation, including a major renewed effort beginning in 2019, has brought the total number of recovered items at Sanxingdui to more than 50,000, spread across additional sacrificial pits uncovered in the decades since. Among all of this, it is the bronze and gold masks that have drawn the most sustained fascination, and for good reason. Unlike anything previously known from ancient Chinese art of comparable age, the Sanxingdui masks depict faces with strikingly exaggerated, almost otherworldly features. Eyes that protrude outward on cylindrical stalks extending several inches from the face, ears flared wide and pointed like wings, mouths drawn into broad, fixed expressions that appear neither entirely human nor clearly representative of any specific deity known from later Chinese religious tradition. Some masks are cast in solid bronze. Others were originally covered in thin sheets of hammered gold, fragments of which have survived and, in a handful of remarkable cases, been recovered largely intact. Radiocarbon dating and associated stratigraphic evidence place these objects within a period generally spanning from roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, corresponding to what archaeologists now recognize as the material culture of the Shu, a Bronze Age civilization that thrived in the Sichuan basin for several centuries before vanishing from the historical record with no clear explanation. And it is that combination, extraordinary artistic and metallurgical sophistication paired with an almost total absence of surrounding context, that has made Sanxingdui such a persistent source of scholarly fascination and public speculation alike. Consider what is missing from the site entirely. No human remains have been found in or around the sacrificial pits, despite their clear ritual character. No written records, whether inscribed on the bronze objects themselves or preserved on any other surviving material, have been discovered anywhere at Sanxingdui or at any known neighboring settlement, leaving archaeologists without a name the Shu might have used for themselves, without any king list, any origin myth, or any direct textual account of what these masks were believed to represent, or why, after generations of clearly significant use, they were deliberately smashed and burned before being buried together in the ground. Mainstream archaeological interpretation generally situates the masks within a broader framework of ancestor veneration and ritual sacrifice, common across many early Chinese Bronze Age cultures, in which cast bronze objects served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, potentially representing deified ancestors, nature spirits, or a supreme deity associated with sight, given the emphasis so many masks place on their dramatically enlarged, forward-projecting eyes. Some researchers have proposed the exaggerated features may reflect efforts to depict divine or superhuman perception, a way of visually signaling that these figures could see or perceive beyond the limits of ordinary human sight, a concept broadly consistent with religious traditions found elsewhere in the ancient world that associate heightened, symbolic eyesight with divine or ancestral authority. The circumstances of the burial itself raise equally difficult questions. Why would a civilization capable of producing objects this technically accomplished, requiring sophisticated bronze casting techniques and considerable material investment, choose to deliberately destroy so many of them at once? Some archaeologists propose the pits represent evidence of a specific historical crisis, a military defeat, a change in ruling dynasty, or a significant religious transformation that prompted the ritualized destruction of the old order's sacred objects, a practice attested in various forms across other ancient cultures undergoing major political or religious upheaval. Others have suggested a more naturalistic explanation may be at least partly responsible for the civilization's eventual disappearance. Researchers examining nearby landslide deposits and geological evidence have proposed that a significant earthquake or a related natural disaster affecting the regional water supply may have disrupted Shu society considerably, though this theory addresses the civilization's broader disappearance more directly than it explains the specific, deliberate act of breaking and burying the ritual objects themselves. What makes Sanxingdui somewhat distinct from other mysteries considered throughout this collection is the scale of confirmed, high-quality material evidence available for study, combined with an almost complete absence of any accompanying textual or linguistic record. Where sites like San Bartolo or Judaculla rock present researchers with incomplete symbolic content that nonetheless connects, however loosely, to a documented cultural or religious tradition, Sanxingdui presents researchers with an enormous quantity of extraordinarily well-preserved physical evidence and almost nothing else. No inscriptions, no king lists, no surviving oral tradition directly connecting the Shu to any later, documented Chinese dynasty or cultural group. This absence has left considerable room for informed speculation, alongside a smaller body of more fringe interpretation. Some researchers have noted stylistic and technical similarities between certain Sanxingdui bronze objects and artifacts recovered from sites much farther afield, including regions along the Yangtze River and parts of Southeast Asia, suggesting the Shu civilization engaged in considerably broader trade and cultural exchange than earlier assumptions about ancient China's relative isolation had allowed for. A smaller number of more speculative voices, working well outside mainstream Chinese archaeology, have pointed to the mask's unusual, almost non-human facial proportions as suggestive of something considerably more exotic. Comparisons that most specialists in the field consider unsupported by the broader archaeological and art historical context, in which similarly stylized, exaggerated features appear across numerous other early Bronze Age ritual traditions worldwide, without requiring any explanation beyond established artistic and religious convention. The Sanxingdui Museum, built near the excavation site, now displays many of the recovered masks and bronze figures to the public, their protruding eyes and flared ears drawing visitors from around the world, still cast in the same fixed, ambiguous expression they held the moment they were lifted from the pits where they had waited, broken and silent, for more than 3,000 years. Who did the Shu believe these faces represented? Were they ancestors, deities, or some category of spirit entirely specific to a belief system that has otherwise vanished without any surviving written trace? And what precisely happened in the moment these objects were smashed and buried together? A single deliberate act that ended one chapter of ritual practice so completely that no written record, no oral memory, and no continuous cultural tradition survived to explain it to those who would eventually dig them back out of the earth. Perhaps somewhere beneath the mounds that gave Sanxingdui its name, still unexcavated after decades of active research, lies whatever additional context might finally answer why a civilization capable of such extraordinary craftsmanship chose in the end to bury its own reflection so completely and so deliberately that even its name did not survive the burial. The bronze faces of Sanxingdui were buried deliberately, sealed away by the very hands that made them. Not every ancient monument was hidden by choice. Some remain exactly where they were carved in plain sight on the surface of the land, and are strange not because they were concealed, but because no one has ever fully explained why they were built at all. High on the Peruvian Altiplano, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, one such structure has stood, carved directly into a cliff face, for reasons still debated by everyone who has studied it. The formation is known today as the Aramu Muru Stone Doorway, sometimes called the Gate of the Gods, or Puerta de Hayu Marca, located within a rock formation called Hayu Marca in a remote wind-swept region of southern Peru near the town of Juli, not far from the Bolivian border. Carved into a large reddish sandstone cliff face, the structure takes the form of a niche roughly 7 feet high and shaped distinctly like a doorway, complete with a smaller recessed indentation near its base. An arrangement that immediately suggests intentional, purposeful construction rather than any obvious product of natural weathering alone. Unlike many of the sites explored throughout this collection, the Aramu Muru doorway presents researchers with an unusually difficult starting problem. There is no definitive archaeological consensus regarding who carved it, when it was carved, or, most strikingly, what its original function was actually meant to be. No inscriptions accompany the formation. No artifacts have been recovered from its immediate surroundings that would allow for confident dating through association, and no clearly documented historical or colonial-era account describes its original construction, leaving researchers largely dependent on regional oral tradition, comparative stylistic analysis, and the physical characteristics of the formation itself. Local tradition in the surrounding region has long associated the site with Aramu Muru, a legendary figure said in some retellings to have been a priest of the Inca Empire, who, following the arrival of Spanish colonial forces, fled toward this remote location carrying a sacred golden disc. According to the version of the story most commonly told, Aramu Muru used this disc in a ritual at the doorway, causing the stone to open and reveal a passage through which he vanished entirely, escaping capture by disappearing into or beyond the rock itself. Whether this account reflects a genuine older Andean oral tradition, a later colonial-era legend, or some blend of both, shaped and reshaped through generations of retelling, remains difficult to determine with confidence, since the story exists almost entirely in oral and popular form, without the kind of documented historical or ethnographic record that would allow researchers to trace its origin with precision. What can be said with somewhat more confidence relates to the broader cultural context of the region. The area surrounding Lake Titicaca was home to several significant pre-Inca cultures, including the Tiwanaku civilization, discussed elsewhere in this collection in connection with the Pokotia Monolith, as well as later Inca administration following the empire's expansion into the region. Given the broader Andean tradition of carving ritually significant niches, doorways, and shrines directly into natural rock formations, a practice well documented at numerous confirmed archaeological sites throughout the region, most archaeologists who have examined the Aramu Muru formation consider it plausible that the structure represents a genuine pre-Columbian ceremonial site, quite possibly used for ritual purposes connected to the surrounding sacred landscape, even without a definitive answer regarding which specific culture originally carved it, or precisely when that work took place. This is where the investigation, much like several others throughout this collection, moves from cautious archaeological interpretation into a considerably wider range of more speculative possibilities, several of which have gained significant traction in popular culture well beyond the relatively narrow academic literature specifically addressing the site. Some researchers, working largely outside mainstream Andean archaeology, have proposed that the doorway framing found in local legend may point toward something considerably more literal than symbolic ritual practice, suggesting the site could represent a genuine portal or gateway, whether understood in a spiritual, dimensional, or, in more speculative interpretations, extraterrestrial sense. Proponents of these theories often point to the formation's unusually smooth, doorway-like shape as evidence of purpose beyond ordinary decorative or ceremonial carving, while critics counter that erosion patterns common to sandstone formations, combined with intentional but relatively modest carving to enhance an already suggestive natural shape, could plausibly account for the structure's appearance without requiring any more extraordinary explanation. Other, somewhat less dramatic alternative theories propose the site may have functioned as an important ceremonial or meditative space tied specifically to shamanic or spiritual practice among local Andean communities, potentially serving as a place where practitioners sought altered states of consciousness or spiritual visions, a purpose broadly consistent with numerous other sacred sites documented throughout Andean religious tradition, even without requiring any interpretation involving literal physical passage through the rock itself. The smaller indentation near the doorway's base has drawn its own share of attention and speculation as well, with some visitors and researchers proposing it may have once held a ceremonial object, potentially a stone or metal disc consistent with the golden disc described in local legend, used in some manner as part of the ritual practice associated with the site, though no physical evidence of any such object has ever been recovered or verified through archaeological excavation. What ultimately makes the Aramu Muru doorway difficult to fully resolve, in a manner distinct from several other cases explored throughout this collection, is the near-total absence of the kind of physical archaeological evidence, artifacts, associated burial sites, or datable organic material that has allowed researchers at other locations to at least narrow down a probable time period or cultural origin, even where specific meaning remains contested. Here, researchers are left working almost entirely from the formation's physical characteristics and its surrounding, largely undocumented oral tradition, a combination that leaves considerable room for interpretation precisely because so little else exists to constrain it. This hasn't diminished the site's contemporary significance, however. Today, the Aramu Muru doorway draws a steady stream of visitors, including many drawn specifically by the site's reputation within certain contemporary spiritual and metaphysical communities who continue to practice meditation and other spiritual rituals directly at the formation, treating it as a place of genuine energetic or spiritual significance, regardless of, or perhaps because of, its unresolved archaeological status. Local guides in the surrounding region continue to share versions of the Aramu Muru legend with visitors, a living oral tradition that, whatever its precise historical origin, has clearly remained culturally active and meaningful within the surrounding community for a considerable span of time. Archaeologists who have examined the site generally caution against either fully embracing the more elaborate legendary and metaphysical interpretations or dismissing the formation as ordinary or insignificant. The carved niche's unusual precision, combined with its plausible connection to broader, well-documented Andean traditions of ritual rock carving, suggests a genuine intentional ceremonial purpose likely lies somewhere behind its creation, even if the specific details of that purpose, along with the identity of those responsible for carving it, remain, for now, essentially unrecoverable through the physical evidence currently available. The doorway itself remains exactly where it has apparently stood for centuries, carved into the cliff face overlooking the surrounding altiplano, its surface weathered but its distinctive shape still clearly, deliberately defined against the surrounding stone. Was this formation created purely as a ceremonial shrine, its doorway shape symbolic rather than literal, meant to represent passage into the sacred or spiritual world rather than any physical opening at all? Did it serve, as local legend insists, as the site of a genuine, specific historical event, whatever its true nature, involving a fleeing priest and a golden disc during the turbulent final years of Inca resistance against Spanish conquest? Or does the formation's persistent association with passage, opening, and disappearance point towards something considerably older and less easily categorized? A belief embedded so deeply within the region's spiritual tradition that its origin predates even the specific legend now most commonly told about it. Perhaps the true answer lies not in the stone itself, unmoving and unchanged despite centuries of speculation, but in whatever oral tradition existed before the version we know today, passed down through generations of a culture whose deeper history, much like the formation's own precise origin, has slipped quietly beyond the reach of the written record. The doorway at Hayumarca still stands against the Altiplano wind, its meaning unresolved, but its stone unmoved for centuries. Not far from there, on the same high plateau, another site raises a related but distinct question, not about the meaning carved into a rock, but about the sheer, staggering effort required to move rocks of a scale that still challenges modern understanding of what a Bronze Age society, working without draft animals, wheeled transport, or iron tools, was actually capable of achieving. The site is Pumapunku, part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological complex located near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in the Bolivian Altiplano at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet. Tiwanaku itself, discussed elsewhere in this collection in connection with the Pokotia Monolith, served as the ceremonial and political heart of a major pre-Inca Andean civilization that flourished roughly between 500 and 1000 AD. But Pumapunku, a distinct platform mound and ceremonial complex within the broader site, has generated a particular, specific kind of fascination, centered not on symbolism or iconography, but on stone and on the seemingly impossible logistics involved in placing it where it now lies, scattered and broken across the plateau. Pumapunku's most striking features are its precisely cut stone blocks, some of which rank among the largest work stones known from the ancient Americas. The largest confirmed block at the site weighs an estimated 131 tons, quarried from andesite and red sandstone sources located a considerable distance from the ceremonial complex itself, with the sandstone specifically traced to a quarry roughly 10 kilometers away, and the harder andesite blocks traced to sources even farther, in some assessments as much as 90 kilometers distant, near Lake Titicaca's shoreline. The distance alone raises an immediate practical question that has occupied engineers and archaeologists for decades. How did a civilization without wheeled vehicles, draft animals capable of hauling loads of this magnitude, iron tools, or, so far as the archaeological record indicates, any form of pulley or complex lifting technology, manage to transport stone blocks weighing well over 100 tons across such considerable distances, then position and precisely fit them into the elaborate stone platforms and structures that once stood at Pumapunku? Mainstream archaeological and engineering analysis generally approaches this question by pointing to what is actually documented, rather than what remains uncertain regarding ancient Andean transport methods. Researchers studying comparable megalithic construction elsewhere in the region have proposed several plausible transport methods, including the use of large wooden sledges, dragged across prepared surfaces using massed human labor, potentially assisted by ropes made from natural fibers, along with the use of temporary earthen ramps to help maneuver blocks into elevated positions once they reach the construction site itself. Some researchers have also proposed that the extremely dry, high-altitude conditions of the Altiplano, combined with seasonal freezing, may have allowed builders to move certain blocks across ice or specially prepared surfaces designed to reduce friction, though direct archaeological evidence confirming this specific technique at Tiwanaku remains limited. None of these proposed methods are inherently implausible on their own. Comparable techniques involving massed human labor, sledges, ramps, and organized logistical coordination are well documented at other major megalithic construction sites around the ancient world, including the pyramids of Egypt, where similarly enormous stone blocks were moved and positioned using methods that, while requiring extraordinary organization and sustained labor, did not require technology beyond what is confirmed to have existed within these respective societies. And yet, what makes Pumapunku somewhat distinct even compared to other extraordinary megalithic sites, is the combination of scale, precision, and remaining uncertainty specifically surrounding the site's chronology and construction sequence. Unlike Egypt's pyramids, where extensive textual records, quarry marks, and worker settlements provide considerable direct evidence regarding construction methods and organization, Tiwanaku left behind no comparable written record. The civilization that built Pumapunku developed no confirmed writing system of the kind that could offer direct testimony regarding how, specifically, its builders approached the logistical challenge these stones represent. This absence of direct testimony becomes particularly significant given the second major element of the Pumapunku mystery: the extraordinary precision of the stonework itself. Several of the site's surviving blocks display remarkably straight edges, precisely cut 90-degree angles, and uniform, repeated geometric cutouts and channels, carved with a level of accuracy that some engineers and stoneworking specialists have described as difficult to replicate even using certain modern tools, let alone the stone, bronze, and bone implements generally understood to have been available to Tiwanaku artisans. Some of the blocks feature identical, repeated H-shaped notches, cut with enough consistency across multiple separate stones that some researchers have proposed the pieces may have been designed for standardized modular construction, potentially fitted together using metal clamps, evidence for which exists in the form of clamp-shaped cavities found cut into several surviving blocks, though the metal clamps themselves have generally not survived, presumably removed and repurposed long after the site's original period of use. This precision has fueled some of the more speculative interpretations that continue to circulate around Pumapunku, interpretations that extend beyond straightforward questions of stone transport into broader questions about the technological capability of the civilization responsible. Some researchers working well outside mainstream archaeological consensus have proposed that the stonework's precision suggests the use of technology considerably more advanced than what is otherwise documented within Tiwanaku material culture, ranging from speculative claims involving lost, more sophisticated tool-making techniques to considerably more fringe theories proposing external or non-human involvement in the site's construction, claims that lack any supporting physical or comparative evidence and remain firmly outside accepted archaeological understanding. Mainstream researchers, while acknowledging the genuine impressiveness of the stonework, generally point to comparable examples of extremely precise stone cutting achieved at other ancient sites around the world, using methods well documented through experimental archaeology, including sustained abrasive grinding using harder stone tools, careful, iterative fitting and adjustment processes, and highly skilled, specialized labor developed and refined over many generations of accumulated craft knowledge. Under this interpretation, Pumapunku's precision, while genuinely remarkable, represents an extreme, particularly well-executed example of stoneworking techniques and traditions that, while not fully documented through surviving written records, likely developed gradually within Tiwanaku society over a considerable span of time, reaching a level of sophistication that later disruptions to the civilization prevented from being passed on much further. Those disruptions add another layer of uncertainty to the site's history. Tiwanaku civilization went into decline sometime around 1000 AD, likely due to a combination of factors including prolonged drought and shifting climate conditions affecting the region's agricultural capacity, and the site was left considerably weathered and disturbed even before modern archaeological study began. Its stones scattered, some looted for use in later colonial-era construction projects, complicating efforts to fully reconstruct the original layout and function of the complex from what remains today. What we're left with, then, is a site that presents extraordinarily strong physical evidence of an advanced, sophisticated stoneworking tradition, combined with a persistent, genuinely unresolved question regarding the exact methods used to transport and position its largest blocks, a gap between demonstrated skill and confirmed process that has made Pumapunku a particularly fertile subject for both serious engineering inquiry and more speculative theorizing alike. The stones remain today, scattered across the plateau near Lake Titicaca, some blocks still bearing their precisely cut notches and channels, others toppled or displaced by centuries of weathering, looting, and, according to some researchers, possibly even the same catastrophic environmental or social disruption that contributed to Tiwanaku's broader decline. How precisely did a civilization without draft animals, wheels, or iron tools move stones weighing well over 100 tons across dozens of kilometers of high-altitude terrain? And once those stones arrived, what specific combination of tools, technique, and accumulated craft knowledge allowed Tiwanaku's artisans to achieve a level of geometric precision that continues to impress engineers working with modern equipment more than 1,000 years after the site's construction and subsequent decline? Perhaps future archaeological work, particularly renewed excavation focused on identifying tool marks, worker settlements, or additional evidence of specific transport and construction methods, will eventually close this particular gap between admiration and explanation. Until then, Pumapunku's scattered stones remain a testament to genuine, confirmed human skill and to a specific practical process that, despite that skill, still hasn't been fully reconstructed by anyone studying the site today. The stones of Pumapunku remain scattered across the Bolivian Altiplano, precisely cut but silent on the question of how they got there. Halfway around the world, in a remote highland valley on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a different set of stone figures raises a related but distinct question. Not how they were moved, but who carved them, when, and why so many stand watching over rice paddies and jungle clearings that, to this day, have never been fully surveyed. The Bada Valley, located in the central Sulawesi province of Indonesia, is a remote highland region accessible only by a demanding overland journey through dense tropical terrain. Scattered throughout this valley and its neighboring valleys of Basoa and Napu are several hundred megalithic statues and stone structures, collectively representing one of the least studied major megalithic traditions anywhere in the world, a fact due partly to the region's genuine remoteness, and partly to the sheer scale of the surrounding jungle, which has likely concealed, and may still conceal, additional statues that formal archaeological survey has simply not yet reached. The statues themselves, carved primarily from andesite boulders, vary considerably in size and style, though many share a broadly consistent basic form. A stylized, somewhat flattened human figure, often depicted with an elongated head, simplified facial features, and, in many examples, prominent, oversized genitalia, a detail that has led several researchers to propose a connection to fertility rituals or ancestor worship, themes broadly consistent with beliefs documented among the region's more recent indigenous communities. The largest of these statues, known locally as Palindo, meaning roughly the entertainer, or the leader, depending on the specific translation offered by different local sources, stands over 4 meters tall, making it the largest confirmed statue in the entire Bada Valley megalithic tradition. Establishing a confident date for these statues has proven considerably more difficult than simply describing their appearance. Unlike several other megalithic traditions explored throughout this collection, the Bada Valley statues lack any directly associated organic material suitable for conventional radiocarbon dating, and no clear stratigraphic excavation context connects them definitively to any specific, well-documented archaeological period. Researchers have proposed a wide range of possible dates, some suggesting construction as early as 3000 BC, based loosely on comparative analysis with other regional megalithic traditions, while others propose a considerably more recent origin, potentially within the last 1 to 2,000 years, closer to the period associated with the region's documented indigenous cultures, whose descendants continue to live in and around the valley today. This uncertainty regarding age sits alongside an equally significant uncertainty regarding purpose and cultural attribution. No confirmed written historical record, whether from indigenous Sulawesi tradition, later Indonesian historical sources, or early European colonial accounts, provides a clear, verified explanation of who specifically carved these statues, or precisely why. What does exist is a body of local oral tradition maintained by communities still living in and around the Bada Valley today, some of which associates the statues with ancestral spirits or guardian figures believed to watch over the surrounding land, a tradition that, much like similar oral connections discussed in relation to Judaculla rock and the Aramu Muru doorway elsewhere in this collection, offers meaningful cultural context without necessarily providing a complete verifiable account of the statue's original construction and specific intended purpose. Mainstream archaeological interpretation generally situates the statues within a broader Southeast Asian tradition of megalithic construction connected to ancestor veneration, a practice documented across numerous cultures throughout the wider Indonesian archipelago and neighboring regions, in which large stone monuments serve to honor deceased community leaders, mark significant burial or ceremonial sites, or function as intermediary figures believed to hold protective or spiritual influence over the surrounding community and its agricultural land. Under this interpretation, the Bada Valley statues likely represent a regional expression of this broader tradition, potentially carved by ancestors of the communities who continue to maintain oral traditions about them today, even if the precise dating and specific ritual details have not survived in fully documented form. What makes the Bada Valley statues particularly difficult to resolve with full confidence, however, is the combination of their considerable number, several hundred confirmed statues and related stone structures across multiple valleys, and the genuinely limited scope of formal archaeological survey conducted in the region to date. Unlike more thoroughly excavated megalithic traditions elsewhere in the world, the Bada Valley's remoteness has meant that comprehensive, systematic archaeological work has progressed considerably more slowly, leaving open the very real possibility that additional statues and potentially additional contextual evidence capable of narrowing the current, wide range of proposed dates remain undiscovered within the surrounding jungle terrain. This gap between known evidence and likely undiscovered material has left room for a range of interpretations beyond the general ancestor veneration framework accepted by most mainstream researchers. Some scholars have proposed that the statues may relate to a specific, now largely undocumented regional culture, distinct from the valley's current indigenous population, potentially representing an earlier settlement or civilization whose relationship to the statue's modern caretakers may be one of inherited stewardship rather than direct, unbroken cultural descent, a distinction that, if accurate, would mean the oral traditions maintained today, while genuinely significant, may not necessarily preserve the statue's original intended meaning in complete form. A smaller number of more speculative theories, circulating primarily outside mainstream Indonesian archaeology, have proposed potential connections between the Bada Valley statues and other prominent world megalithic traditions, drawing loose stylistic comparisons to statues found in locations as geographically distant as Easter Island, suggestions that lack any supporting evidence of direct contact or cultural transmission and are not generally supported within mainstream comparative archaeology, given the vast geographic separation involved and the absence of any other corroborating evidence suggesting sustained ancient contact between these specific, widely separated regions. The valley's practical inaccessibility has also complicated efforts to protect the statues from looting and environmental degradation, an ongoing concern for Indonesian heritage authorities, particularly given the statue's andesite composition, which, while durable, remains vulnerable over time to erosion, agricultural encroachment, and, in a smaller number of documented cases, deliberate damage or removal. Local communities in the Bada Valley continue to live alongside these statues much as, according to available evidence, their ancestors likely have for a considerable span of generations, incorporating the figures into local identity and, in some cases, ongoing ritual or ceremonial practice, even without full academic consensus regarding the statue's precise age or original purpose. Who were the people responsible for carving these hundreds of stone figures, scattered across a valley whose full extent has still not been comprehensively surveyed? Were they the direct ancestors of the communities who maintain oral traditions about them today, or the members of an earlier culture whose specific identity has since been absorbed, replaced, or simply forgotten by the generations that followed? And how many additional statues, along with whatever contextual evidence might finally help resolve the wide range of proposed dates currently under discussion, remain hidden within the dense jungle terrain surrounding the valley, waiting for a survey that has, so far, never had the resources or access necessary to fully explore the region's true scope. Perhaps the answer to Palindo's silent gaze and to the hundreds of similar figures scattered across the Bada, Basoa, and Napu valleys lies not in a single, decisive discovery, but in the slow, patient work of surveying jungle terrain that has resisted full archaeological access for as long as these statues have stood watching over it, waiting, much like so many other unresolved mysteries throughout this collection, for whoever eventually has the means and the persistence to finally look closely enough. The statues of the Bada Valley keep their watch over jungle terrain still only partially surveyed, their meaning tied to communities whose oral traditions remain incomplete. Not every mystery in this collection involves an object too large to move or a valley too remote to fully explore. Sometimes the puzzle fits in two hands, discovered not deep in unmapped jungle, but in a cellar, decades after it had already been removed from the ground. The object is known as the Fuente Magna Bowl, a large ceremonial vessel carved from stone, discovered sometime in the 1950s near Lake Titicaca, in the Bolivian region associated with the broader Tiwanaku cultural sphere already discussed elsewhere in this collection, in connection with Pumapunku and the Pokotia Monolith. According to the most commonly cited account, the bowl was uncovered by a local farmer and eventually made its way into the possession of Bolivia's Museo Nacional de Arqueología, where it remained in storage, largely unexamined by the broader scholarly community, for several decades before drawing renewed and considerably more intense scrutiny beginning in the 1990s. The bowl itself is substantial, measuring roughly 18 inches in diameter, carved from a dark stone, and decorated around its interior and exterior surfaces with a combination of relief imagery and rows of engraved characters. The imagery includes a depiction some researchers have interpreted as representing a version of the goddess Fauna, alongside other figures and symbols whose specific meaning within the broader Tiwanaku or related Indian religious tradition remains only partially understood. It is the engraved characters, however, running in structured lines across significant portions of the bowl's surface, that have made the Fuente Magna Bowl one of the more contentious and widely debated objects in South American archaeology. According to several researchers who have examined the inscriptions, the characters bear a striking resemblance to cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system developed in ancient Mesopotamia and used across numerous Near Eastern cultures for thousands of years, beginning with the Sumerians in the region of modern-day Iraq. Some proponents of this comparison have gone further still, proposing that the script specifically resembles a form of Proto-Sumerian or Early Sumerian cuneiform, and have offered translations suggesting the inscriptions include references to religious devotion and offerings to a Mesopotamian deity, interpretations that, if accurate, would represent an almost unthinkable connection between ancient Bolivian and ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, separated by an ocean, a hemisphere, and, according to essentially all conventional historical understanding, several thousand years and no documented means of direct contact. It's difficult to overstate how significant a genuine connection of this kind would be if fully substantiated. Sumerian cuneiform developed in a specific, well-documented historical and geographic context, evolving gradually from earlier pictographic systems within Mesopotamia over the course of many centuries, with an extensive body of comparative inscriptions available for scholars to study and cross-reference. Finding a genuine, contextually verified example of this same script on a ceremonial object recovered from the Bolivian Altiplano, thousands of miles from its point of origin and with no comparable examples ever discovered anywhere else in the Americas, would require researchers to substantially reconsider long-held assumptions about the isolation of pre-Columbian Andean civilization from the broader ancient world. Mainstream archaeologists and epigraphers, for their part, have approached these claims with very significant skepticism, and the reasons extend well beyond simple resistance to an unconventional idea. The bowl's provenance itself presents an immediate and serious complication. Because it was reportedly discovered decades before receiving serious scholarly attention, and because detailed, contemporaneous documentation of its original discovery context was never properly recorded or preserved, researchers today have no reliable, independently verified account of precisely where or under what specific circumstances the bowl was originally found. This absence of secure provenance makes it considerably more difficult to rule out the possibility, raised by several skeptical researchers, that the bowl may represent a more modern forgery, potentially created specifically to include cuneiform-style engravings, whether as a deliberate hoax or through some other, less clearly malicious form of embellishment added after the vessel's original, genuinely ancient creation. Specialists in Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian epigraphy who have examined published images and casts of the bowl's inscriptions have generally expressed considerable doubt regarding the specific cuneiform interpretation, noting inconsistencies in how individual characters are formed compared to verified, well-documented Sumerian script, along with concerns that the proposed translations rely on selectively interpreting ambiguous marks in ways that a genuinely rigorous, independent epigraphic analysis would likely not support. Some researchers have proposed that the inscriptions may represent something else entirely, an as yet unidentified or poorly understood Andean symbolic tradition that simply happens to bear superficial resemblance to cuneiform, a phenomenon not unheard of when comparing simple, wedge-like or angular incised marks across entirely unrelated ancient cultures separated by vast distances. And yet, the case has not been definitively closed in either direction, largely because of the very same provenance problem that fuels skepticism about the bowl's authenticity in the first place. Without a secure, independently verified excavation context, and without access to universally agreed upon, rigorous testing of the stone's material composition, tool marks, and relative wear patterns, conducted by researchers without a vested interest in either confirming or dismissing the more extraordinary interpretation, the bowl remains difficult to fully authenticate or fully debunk through the kind of definitive, independently repeatable analysis that would normally settle a dispute of this magnitude. Adding a further layer of complexity, a smaller stone tablet, sometimes referred to as the Pokotia Monolith's companion piece, though more accurately understood as a related but separate object, has occasionally been discussed alongside the Fuente Magna bowl in some literature addressing potential ancient transoceanic contact, given its own previously discussed, though similarly contested, resemblance to certain ancient Near Eastern scripts. Whether these separate claims genuinely reinforce one another, or whether their recurring pairing in popular discussion simply reflects a broader pattern of researchers drawing connections between multiple ambiguous South American artifacts and distant Old World writing systems, remains itself a matter of ongoing debate rather than settled fact. The Fuente Magna bowl remains housed today within Bolivia's Museo Nacional de Arqueología, still displayed, still photographed, and still cited regularly by researchers on both sides of a debate that shows little sign of fully resolving anytime soon. Bolivian archaeologists and government cultural authorities have, at various points, expressed support for further, more rigorous scientific analysis of the object, though comprehensive, universally accepted testing addressing every open question surrounding its authenticity, dating, and inscriptional content has not, to date, been fully completed and published in a manner capable of satisfying skeptics and proponents alike. What precisely do the characters engraved across the Fuente Magna bowl's surface actually represent? Are they genuine evidence of contact between ancient Andean and ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, achieved through some means not yet accounted for within conventional historical understanding? Are they an independently developed Andean symbolic tradition whose resemblance to cuneiform is ultimately coincidental, a product of the limited number of ways angular marks can be pressed into stone or clay? Or is the bowl itself, whatever its original age and cultural origin, later altered or entirely fabricated at some point during the several decades between its reported discovery and its eventual, closer, scholarly examination? Perhaps the answer depends less on any single new discovery and more on finally securing the kind of rigorous, independently verified provenance and material analysis that the bowl's own history, obscured by decades spent quietly out of scholarly view, has so far made almost impossible to fully establish.